Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. My hands trembled as I loaded shells into my shotgun. The cold Alaskan air bit at my exposed skin, but fear, not the temperature, made me shiver. I'm Steve Johnson, born and raised in Yakutat, Alaska. What I'm about to tell you happened in the late 1970s, though the memories remain as fresh as yesterday's footprints in snow. Forest Lake sits about 30 miles northeast of Yakutat. For generations, my people had gone there to pick berries, plump, sweet treasures that grew in abundance around the lake's edges. The first time I saw it watching us, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. Something tall stood between two pines at the forest edge, partially hidden but unmistakably present. "Hey, Marion," I called to my cousin who was working 20 yards away. "You see that over there?" Marion straightened up, berry basket in hand, and squinted toward where I pointed. "Jesus," he whispered, dropping his basket. Berries scattered across the ground. What we saw was no bear. Bears we understood, bears we could handle. This was something else entirely. A massive figure, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, standing upright on 2 legs. It just watched us that day. We gathered our things quickly and left, walking backward to the truck, never taking our eyes off the tree line. The drive back to Yakutat was silent, except for Marion finally saying, "That was a Sasquatch. My grandfather wasn't crazy after all." The next week, 5 of us returned. Safety in numbers, we figured. James, Marion's brother, brought his rifle. "Just in case," he said, though none of us really thought we'd need it. The creature appeared again, this time closer. I estimated it stood about 100 yards away. It was enormous, shoulders broader than any man I'd ever seen, covered in dark brown hair that hung in matted clumps. Its face was flat, with a pronounced brow ridge. I could see intelligence in its eyes. That's what unsettled me most. "Don't move," James whispered, raising his rifle slowly. "Don't shoot it," I hissed. "Just let it be." The creature watched us for 10 minutes before melting back into the trees. We continued picking berries, but every few seconds someone's head would snap up, scanning the forest edge. Over the next month, word spread through Yakutat. Some laughed it off as hysteria or tall tales. Others, mostly elders, nodded knowingly. They had stories of their own, passed down through generations, of the tall ones who lived in the deepest parts of the forest. By midsummer, the creature, we'd taken to calling it the Watcher, had grown bolder. It would emerge from the trees and stand just 50 yards away, observing our berry picking. Sometimes it would pace back and forth along the tree line, like a predator sizing up prey. "It's getting too comfortable with us," said Earl Thompson, one of the older men in our community. "That ain't good." The breaking point came in early August. My sister-in-law Doreen and her 2 children, aged 8 and 10, were picking berries with 3 other women. The creature appeared suddenly, much closer than before, and moved toward them with purpose. They abandoned their baskets and ran for their vehicle. Doreen swore it had followed them for half a mile, keeping pace easily despite their panicked sprint. That night, men gathered at my house. The mood was grim. "It's stalking us now," Earl said, his weathered face tight with concern. "Been picking berries there my whole life. My parents before me, their parents before them. We can't just abandon our gathering grounds." James nodded. "What happens when it decides to come into town? My kids wait for the school bus in the dark." The decision wasn't made lightly. None of us wanted this, but fear for our families overrode everything else. 8 of us would go to Forest Lake, armed, and confront the creature. Not to kill it, none of us wanted that, but to scare it away from our traditional grounds. The morning we set out was overcast, threatening rain. We loaded into 2 pickup trucks, shotguns and rifles secured in racks. My stomach churned with dread. This felt wrong, but I couldn't see another way. "We fire warning shots first," I reminded everyone as we unloaded at the lake. "We're not here to kill it, just to scare it off." We spread out along the berry patches, pretending to pick while keeping our weapons close. 3 hours passed with no sign of the creature. I began to hope it had sensed our intentions and moved on. Then Marion's voice broke the silence. "There! By the big spruce!" I turned to see the massive figure step from the trees. It stood fully in the open for the first time, and the sight stole my breath. It was bigger than I'd estimated, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, with a bulk that had to push 800 pounds. Its body was covered in dark hair except for its face and palms. The face was eerily human-like, yet not human at all. A flat nose, deep-set eyes under a heavy brow, a wide mouth currently pulled back to reveal large teeth. "Hold steady," I called out, raising my shotgun to point skyward. "Warning shots on my count." The creature took another step forward, then another. 1, 2, 3. 8 weapons discharged into the air. The sound was deafening, echoing across the lake. Birds erupted from trees. The creature stopped, then did something none of us expected. It roared back at us, a sound so primal and powerful that I felt it in my chest cavity. Then it charged. Everything happened in seconds. The creature moved with shocking speed, heading straight toward James and Earl. More shots rang out, this time not aimed at the sky. I saw the creature stumble as one shot connected, then another. It turned, presenting its back, and I fired instinctively. My shot caught it high on the back. Dark blood appeared on its matted fur. The creature let out a sound, not a roar this time, but a high-pitched cry that sounded disturbingly human. It turned and crashed back into the forest, leaving a trail of broken underbrush. We stood frozen, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. "Jesus Christ," Earl whispered. "Did we kill it?" "Don't think so," James replied, his voice shaking. "But we hit it for sure." We followed the blood trail for about 50 yards before stopping. The drops grew smaller, more spaced out. The creature was wounded, but moving well enough to escape. "We should leave," I said, suddenly afraid. "We've done enough." The ride back to Yakutat was silent. What had started as a mission to protect our families now felt shameful. We'd wounded a creature that, despite its intimidating presence, had never actually harmed any of us. 2 weeks passed before anyone dared return to Forest Lake. 6 of us went, armed again, but hoping not to use our weapons. The berry season was peaking, and many families relied on the harvest to last through winter. We saw it watching from a distance, but something had changed. It kept farther back, partially hidden among the trees. Through binoculars, I could make out a dark scar running across its upper back where my shot had connected. Throughout the rest of that season, the pattern continued. The creature would appear, watching from a safe distance, but never approached as closely as before. Many in the community still refused to go to Forest Lake, finding other, less abundant berry patches closer to town. By the following summer, sightings became rarer. The creature had grown more cautious, more reclusive. Sometimes we'd find footprints, massive impressions that dwarfed a man's boot, or broken branches high up where no human could reach. Occasionally, someone would glimpse a large, dark shape moving through distant trees. But the bold appearances of that first summer never repeated. Years passed. I continued visiting Forest Lake every summer. Sometimes I'd feel eyes on me from the forest, that prickly sensation on the back of my neck that told me I wasn't alone. But the creature kept its distance. In 1999, a law enforcement officer from Washington named Fred Bradshaw came to Yakutat. He'd heard stories about our Sasquatch encounters and wanted to document them. I told him everything, including the shooting incident I still regretted. Bradshaw interviewed others too, Marion, James, Earl, and several more who'd had their own encounters. "Do you think it's still out there?" Bradshaw asked me as we sat in my living room, his tape recorder running between us. Yes, I said without hesitation, but it's learned to avoid us. Do you ever see it anymore? I hesitated, then told him about my last trip to Forest Lake the previous summer. I'd gone alone, something I rarely did. While picking berries, I'd heard a sound that made me look up. There it stood, at the forest edge, watching me. The distance was too great to see the scar on its back, but I knew it was the same creature. We looked at each other for a long moment before it turned and disappeared into the forest. I don't think it's malicious, I told Bradshaw, just territorial, and now cautious. That confrontation changed things. Do you regret shooting it? He asked. Every day, I answered truthfully. We acted out of fear, not understanding. If I could go back, I'd try to find another way. After Bradshaw left, his report circulated in various Bigfoot research circles. Some researchers came to Yakutat hoping for their own encounter, but most left disappointed. The creature had become a ghost, visible only to those who'd known it before. Last summer, I took my grandson to Forest Lake for the first time. He's 10, full of questions and energy. As we picked berries, I kept one eye on the forest edge, half hoping, half fearing to see that familiar shape. Grandpa, is that a bear? My grandson asked suddenly, pointing toward a gap between two large spruces. I looked up quickly, my heart racing. For a brief moment I saw it, the tall, dark figure partially obscured by branches. Our eyes met across the distance. I could swear I saw recognition there. No, I said quietly. That's not a bear. That's something much rarer. My grandson strained to see, but the figure had already melted back into the forest shadows. Will it hurt us? He asked, edging closer to me. I put my arm around his shoulders. No, it's just curious about us, same as we are about it. We share this land, always have. As we drove back to Yakutat that evening, my grandson full of excited chatter about his Bigfoot sighting, I thought about the complex relationship between our community and the creature. Fear had driven us to violence all those years ago, but time had established a kind of wary coexistence. The Sasquatch still carries the scar from my shotgun blast, and we still carry the knowledge that something wild and unknown shares our forests, watching from the shadows. Some wounds never fully heal, but they can teach us to treat the mysteries of this world with more respect than fear. Story 2. The morning air bit at my face as I trudged up the north slope of Bear Mountain. It was August 23rd, 1996, and I'd left my pickup at the logging road turnout just after 5 a.m. Dawn was breaking over the Alaskan wilderness, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the morning dew. Perfect hunting conditions. I'd been scouting this area for 3 days already. The deer population seemed good this season, and I needed to fill my freezer before winter. My breath came out in small clouds as I hiked along the ridge running toward Ketchikan Lakes, just 2 miles north of town, close enough to civilization, but far enough to find good game. The weight of my .300 Weatherby Magnum rifle felt reassuring against my shoulder. I'd owned it for 12 years, and it hadn't failed me yet. The scope was recently calibrated, and I had 3 rounds in the chamber, plus a full magazine. My orange hunting vest was zip-tight against the morning chill, and my boots were breaking in nicely after I'd waterproofed them last week. I paused to check my GPS. Right on track. The ridge offered good visibility in multiple directions, perfect for spotting movement below. I took a swig from my canteen, the cold water refreshing after the uphill climb. That's when I noticed movement about 100 yards downslope, partially hidden behind a massive fallen Sitka spruce. Something dark and large was moving there. I slowly lowered my canteen and raised my binoculars. Black fur. Big. Had to be a bear. My heart rate picked up. Bear season was open, and a black bear would provide good meat and a nice pelt. I'd taken 3 bears over the years, all clean, ethical kills. I set down my pack quietly and raised my rifle, peering through the scope. The animal was partially obscured, but I could make out enough of its shape behind the log. Definitely a bear. I could see the dark fur and the mass of its body. Its head was down, probably foraging. Perfect shot opportunity. I controlled my breathing, exhaled halfway, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The shot echoed across the mountain. Birds scattered from nearby trees. I kept my eye to the scope, expecting to see the bear drop. Instead, what happened next sent ice through my veins. The figure stood up, straight up, on 2 legs. My finger froze on the trigger. This was no bear. Whatever I'd shot at was tall, really tall. It stood at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its entire body was covered in dark hair or fur. The creature's build was massive, broad shoulders, thick torso, powerful-looking limbs. It had no neck that I could see, just a head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. It turned, not like a bear would turn, but like a person, like a man. Then it simply walked away, its long arms swinging at its sides. I lowered my rifle, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The creature showed no signs of being hit. It moved with purpose, but didn't run or show any distress. It simply walked into the tree line and disappeared from view. "Hey!" I shouted, not knowing why. My voice sounded small against the vastness of the mountain. "Hey!" I called again. No response, just the wind in the trees and my own rapid breathing. I stood frozen for several minutes, my mind racing. What had I just seen? It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit, not out here, not moving like that. The way it stood and walked was too fluid, too natural, too real. When my legs finally agreed to move again, I approached the fallen log where the creature had been. The distance seemed to stretch forever as I picked my way down the slope, my rifle held ready, though I wasn't sure what I'd do if I encountered the being again. The ground around the log showed signs of disturbance, broken ferns, compressed moss, but there was no blood, no hair, no tracks clear enough to photograph or cast. The soft forest floor held indistinct depressions that could have been footprints, but nothing definitive. I searched for 30 minutes, methodically moving in expanding circles from the log. Nothing. No blood trail, no broken branches showing the direction it had gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. By noon, I'd given up the search. The excitement of the hunt was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease. I packed up my gear and headed back to my truck, constantly scanning the trees around me. The forest that had felt so familiar that morning now seemed alien and watchful. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for weeks. Who would believe me? I'd been hunting these mountains since I was 14 years old. I knew the difference between a bear and whatever this was. But saying it out loud, saying I might have shot at a Sasquatch, seemed insane. 3 days after the incident, I couldn't stand it anymore. I returned to Bear Mountain this time with my buddy Mike Thornton. I didn't tell him what I'd seen, just that I'd spotted an unusual bear and wanted to track it. "You're acting weird, Steve," Mike said as we hiked up the same ridge. "You sure you're not coming down with something?" "I'm fine," I replied, eyes scanning the tree line. "Just want to check something out." We reached the fallen log by mid-morning. I showed Mike where I'd taken the shot from and where the bear had been standing. "And you missed?" Mike asked incredulously. He knew I rarely missed a shot at that range. "Guess so," I mumbled. We found nothing new that day. No unusual tracks, no tufts of hair, no broken branches at 7 feet high. After a few hours, Mike lost interest. "Sometimes you just miss, Steve. Happens to everyone. Let's head over to Beaver Falls and see if we can spot some deer instead." I nodded, but my heart wasn't in it. For the rest of the hunting season, I couldn't focus. Every dark shape in the woods made me jump. Every snapping twig sounded like footsteps. I filled my deer tag eventually. but my heart wasn't in it. Winter came and went. Spring thaw arrived, and with it the memories I'd tried to bury. I'd told no one except my wife, Jane, who listened without judgment but suggested maybe the light had played tricks on my eyes. "Stress can do funny things to a person's perception," she said, patting my hand. But I knew what I'd seen. By summer 1997, the encounter had settled into an uncomfortable memory. I continued hunting other areas, Deer Mountain, Harriet Hunt Lake, even took a trip up to Hyder, but I avoided the north slope of Bear Mountain. It wasn't until October 1997, 14 months after the incident, that anything else unusual happened. I was at Sourdough Bar in Ketchikan, nursing a beer while the Seahawks game played on the TV above the bar. A group of loggers from the Ketchikan Pulp Company were talking loudly at a table near the back. "I'm telling you, something's out there," one of them said, his voice carrying across the half-empty bar. "Troy saw it 2 weeks ago off the Ward Lake Road." I shouldn't have walked over, shouldn't have inserted myself into their conversation, but I did. "What did Troy see?" I asked, standing awkwardly beside their table. The logger who'd been speaking looked up at me, surprised. "Who's asking?" "Steve Brewster," I said. "I hunt these parts. Just curious." The men exchanged glances before the speaker shrugged. "Troy's on the cutting crew up past Ward Lake. Said he saw something walking through the trees early morning. Thought it was a bear at first, but it was walking on 2 legs, real tall, covered in dark hair." My stomach tightened. "Did he get a good look at it?" "Good enough to drink himself stupid 2 nights running," another logger chimed in. "Troy ain't exactly the stable type, though. Got a reputation for seeing things, if you know what I mean." They all laughed, but it sounded forced. I thanked them and returned to my beer, my mind racing. Someone else had seen it. By 1998, I'd heard 3 more stories: a fisherman near Carlana Lake, a hiker on the Deer Mountain Trail, a teenager camping with friends near Connell Lake. All descriptions matched what I'd seen: tall, hairy, humanoid but not human, always briefly glimpsed, always solitary. I began researching, first at the Ketchikan Public Library, then through interlibrary loans. I read everything I could find about Sasquatch and Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Some accounts were clearly hoaxes or misidentifications. Others seemed more credible. Many matched details of my own experience with uncomfortable precision. In January 1999, I saw an ad in the Ketchikan Daily News. A researcher from the University of Alaska Fairbanks was collecting accounts of unexplained wilderness encounters in southeast Alaska. Dr. Robert Masterson was offering confidential interviews and documentation of experiences. I called the number and left a message, not expecting much. 3 days later, Dr. Masterson called back. His voice was professional, matter of fact. He asked basic questions about when and where my encounter had occurred, then suggested we meet when he visited Ketchikan the following week. We met at the Landing Restaurant on a rainy Tuesday. Dr. Masterson was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with a neat beard and wire-rimmed glasses. He ordered coffee and set up a small tape recorder between us. "Is that necessary?" I asked, eyeing the device. "Only if you're comfortable," he said, his finger hovering over the record button. "I find it helps me avoid missing details. This stays confidential unless you give permission otherwise." I hesitated, then nodded. He pressed record and asked me to state my name and the date of the encounter. For the next hour, I recounted everything in detail: the morning conditions, the position on the ridge, the shot, and what happened after. Dr. Masterson took notes while the tape recorder ran, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never interrupting the flow of my story. When I finished, he sat back and studied me for a long moment. "You're not the first hunter I've interviewed who's had a similar experience, Mr. Brewster," he said finally. "What concerns me is that you actually fired at the creature." The word creature sent a chill through me. "I thought it was a bear," I replied defensively. Of course, Dr. Masterson nodded. And thankfully, it appears you missed. But this raises some interesting questions. The being showed no signs of injury, despite being fired upon with a high-powered rifle at relatively close range. Either your shot missed entirely or... He trailed off, but the implication hung in the air. Or what? I prompted. Dr. Masterson closed his notebook. There are accounts, Mr. Brewster, of these beings having unusual physical properties, resistance to injury, rapid healing, the ability to appear and disappear in dense forest without leaving typical signs of passage. You're saying they're not animals. I'm saying we don't know what they are, he corrected. The scientific community remains divided, and evidence is frustratingly scarce, which is why first-hand accounts like yours are so valuable. As the interview concluded, Dr. Masterson handed me his card. If you remember anything else, or if you have another encounter, please call me. I tucked the card into my wallet, where it would remain untouched for years. I'm glad I missed, I told him before we parted. Whatever it was, I wouldn't have felt right about hurting it. Dr. Masterson's expression softened. That speaks well of you, Mr. Brewster. It's been 27 years since that morning on Bear Mountain. I still hunt, though these days it's more for the peace of the forest than the need for meat. My knees aren't what they used to be, and I stay closer to the roads. I've never had another encounter like that August day in 1996. Sometimes I wonder if it really happened the way I remember it. Memory plays tricks, especially over decades. But then, I'll be sitting in my stand at dawn, watching the forest wake up, and I'll feel eyes on me. Not threatening, just aware. The north slope of Bear Mountain is different now. Logging operations have expanded and new hiking trails crisscross the lower elevations. Progress marches on. But the upper reaches remain wild, especially in the ravines and valleys that stretch toward Ketchikan Lakes. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there. That tall figure that walked away from my bullet. I wonder if it remembers me as clearly as I remember it. I wonder if it understands how close it came to becoming a specimen, a proof, a headline. Most of all, I'm grateful my shot went wide. Whatever I saw that day, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or something science hasn't named yet, it had as much right to those mountains as I did. More, probably, given how long its kind must have roamed these forests unseen. I've had plenty of opportunities to tell my story more widely. Documentaries, websites, podcasts. They reach out occasionally, having heard rumors or found Dr. Masterson's research. I always decline. Let the creature keep its secrets. Let it walk the ridges in peace. But sometimes, on clear autumn nights when the stars are bright over Ketchikan, I sit on my porch and look toward Bear Mountain. And I wonder if, somewhere in those dark forests, something looks back. Story 3. My name is James Edenshaw. I've lived in Ketchikan all my life, carving wood and stone in the traditions of my Tlingit and Haida ancestors. The forests of southeast Alaska have been my second home for as long as I can remember. But what I saw on October 12th, 1982, changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. The morning started like any other day I'd set aside for gathering inspiration. I packed light. Just water, jerky, my sketchbook, and a small flashlight. The air had that crisp fall bite, the kind that makes your lungs feel clean when you breathe deep. Leaves crunched beneath my boots as I made my way north of Bear Valley, an area I'd explored many times before. The morning fog still hung between the Sitka spruce and western hemlock as I hiked. No sounds but birds, wind, and the occasional scurry of small animals in the underbrush. I'd been thinking about a new series of masks, something that captured the spirit of these mountains, and I wanted to sit with the land a while. By midday, I'd wandered farther than usual into a section of rocky hillsides I hadn't fully explored before. The clouds had burned off, leaving that rare, clear blue sky we don't often get around here. As I climbed a particularly steep slope of loose shale, I noticed something unusual. a dark crack in the hillside that seemed to extend back into the rock face. I approached it cautiously. Living in Alaska, you learn to respect caves and crevices. Bears and other creatures seek shelter in such places. But curiosity pulled me forward. The opening was narrow, maybe 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, just big enough for me to squeeze through if I turned sideways. Cool air flowed out from it, carrying a musty, earthy smell. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it inside. The beam revealed a tight passageway extending maybe 15 feet into the hillside, then appearing to open up into something larger. No sign of recent animal activity. No tracks, no scat, no scratch marks. I decided it was worth investigating. I turned sideways and edged into the passage, the rock walls pressed against my chest and back. Claustrophobia wasn't something I normally struggled with, but in that narrow space, I felt my heart rate quicken. The flashlight beam bounced off the damp walls as I inched forward. Water dripped somewhere deep inside, the sound echoing through the passage. After about 10 feet, the passage curved slightly to the right, then began to slope downward. I had to crouch lower to continue. Another 5 feet and the passage opened slightly before terminating at what appeared to be a small window-like opening, roughly 1 foot tall and 2 feet wide. Beyond this opening was darkness, but I could feel a larger space. The air moved differently, less confined. I knelt down and directed my flashlight through the opening. The beam cut through the darkness to reveal a cave about 30 feet across and perhaps 15 feet high at its center. The floor sloped down from my position near the ceiling of the space. Water had carved this place over countless centuries, leaving smooth curves in the rock and creating columns where stalactites had joined with stalagmites. Then my light caught something that didn't belong. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Against the far wall of the cave, perhaps 20 feet from my position, sat what I initially took to be a boulder covered in moss or dark vegetation. But as I adjusted my flashlight, I realized with a jolt that I was looking at something alive. It sat with its back against the wall, massive shoulders hunched forward, head tilted slightly down as if in sleep. The creature was covered in long, dark hair, almost black, but with hints of deep brown, where my light hit it directly. The hair hung in matted clumps from its arms and shoulders, some strands easily 8 to 10 inches long. I froze completely, not even daring to breathe. The creature didn't move. Its chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of deep sleep, each breath making a soft rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate the very air in the cave. Slowly, carefully, I shifted my position to get a better look through the opening. The movement caused a small rock to dislodge beneath my knee, making a distinct clicking sound as it rolled down into the cave. I held my breath, but the creature didn't stir. From my new angle, I could see more clearly. What I was looking at defied everything I understood about the wildlife of Southeast Alaska. The being sat on the cave floor, with legs extended outward, arms resting on massive thighs. Its head was enormous, rose approximately 5 feet from the cave floor, which meant the creature sitting down was taller than me standing up. Its shoulders spanned at least 4 feet across, with powerful arms thicker than my thighs. But it was the face that gripped me with a mixture of awe and primal fear. Unlike the rest of the body, the face had minimal hair, just enough to frame what could only be described as a face that was both ape-like and disturbingly human. The skin was leathery, dark grey, weathered like an old man who'd spent decades exposed to the elements. A broad, flat nose with wide nostrils dominated the center of the face. Below that, slightly parted lips revealed hints of large teeth. What struck me most were the patches of grizzled white hair on its cheeks, like an old man's stubble grown wild. I realized with sudden clarity what I was looking at. The stories told by elders, the tracks found in remote areas, the strange sounds reported by hunters. This was Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the creature of countless campfire stories and native legends. And I was not 8 feet away from one. My mouth went dry, sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool cave air. The creature's chest continued its slow rise and fall. A sound emerged from it, not quite a snore, more like a deep rumbling growl that vibrated at a frequency I could feel in my chest. I had to force myself to think clearly. This was no time for panic. The creature was asleep, and I needed to keep it that way. My position at the small opening meant I was near the ceiling of the cave, looking down at an angle. If the creature stood, its head would nearly reach where I was perched. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, and simply observed. There was no distinct neck visible, just a massive head that seemed to sit directly on enormous, trapezoid-shaped shoulders. The arms ended in hands that looked capable of crushing stone, with thick fingers tipped by blackened nails that more resembled claws. The moment stretched into eternity. Part of me wanted to reach for my sketchbook, to document what no artist had ever seen with such clarity. But I dared not make any movement that might disturb this sleeping giant. After what must have been about 10 seconds but felt like hours, I made my decision. This was not my place. I was an intruder here, in the home of something ancient and powerful. With painful slowness, I began to back away from the opening, moving centimeter by centimeter to avoid making any sound. The passage seemed narrower now, more confining. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain it would echo through the cave and wake the creature. Sweat made my palms slick on the rock as I eased myself backward through the tight space. Every muscle in my body tensed with the effort of moving silently. When I reached the curve in the passage, I allowed myself to move slightly faster, putting a bit more distance between myself and the sleeping giant. The light from the entrance grew brighter as I approached, and finally I squeezed back out into the forest air. I didn't stop moving. Without looking back, I walked quickly away from the hillside, putting distance between myself and the cave entrance. Only when I was 100 yards away did I allow myself to collapse against a tree trunk, legs shaking, breath coming in quick gasps. I sat there for perhaps 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd seen. My training as an artist made me want to document everything while it was fresh in my mind. With trembling hands, I pulled out my sketchbook and began to draw. The massive shoulders, the enormous hands, the weathered ancient face with its patches of grey hair. As I drew, my breathing steadied. The initial shock began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of wonder. I had seen something few people ever would, a creature that most of the world considered myth or legend, sleeping peacefully in its hidden sanctuary. I finished my sketches, closed my book, and began the hike back to town. With each step, I debated what to do with this experience. Should I tell others? Would anyone believe me? What if people went looking for the creature, intent on capturing or killing it? By the time I reached the outskirts of Ketchikan, I had made my decision. I would keep the exact location to myself. I would tell the story, show my sketches, but I would never lead anyone to that specific hillside, that specific crack in the rock. The sleeping giant deserved its peace. That night, in the quiet of my workshop, I began carving. My hands seemed to move of their own accord, bringing to life in cedar what my eyes had witnessed. The broad face, the powerful shoulders, the ancient weathered countenance that had seen centuries come and go in these forests. For weeks afterward, I found myself looking over my shoulder on my forest walks, scanning the tree line for movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong. But I never went back to that specific hillside. Some doors, once opened, should be respectfully closed. In the years since, I've shared my story with a few trusted individuals, researchers who approach the subject with respect, elders from neighboring tribes who have their own stories of the forest people. My sketches and carvings have raised eyebrows, sparked debates, drawn both criticism and wonder. Some say I dreamed it all, or that I exaggerated a bear sighting. Others believe every word. I don't concern myself too much with either reaction. I know what I saw in that cave north of Bear Valley in 1982. I know the way the hair hung in long strands from those massive arms. I know the sound of that creature's breathing, like ancient winds moving through deeper, older forests than any that remain today. 4 decades have passed since that October morning. My hands are not as steady with the carving knife as they once were. My own beard has taken on the grizzled white patches that I observed on that sleeping face. But I have never forgotten a single detail of those 10 seconds when I found myself face to face with the impossible. Sometimes on clear autumn days when the air has that same crispness, I find myself looking north toward Bear Valley. I wonder if that creature still sleeps in its hidden cave, or if it has long since moved on to more remote regions as humans push ever deeper into the wilderness. I wonder if it ever woke that day, sensing my presence, but choosing to remain still, observing me just as I observed it. I wonder, but I do not return. Some encounters are gifts that were never meant to be repeated. Some mysteries are meant to remain just that, mysteries. But sometimes, in my dreams, I find myself back in that narrow passage, light fading behind me, the sound of deep, rumbling breath drawing me forward into the darkness. And in those dreams, sometimes, the eyes open. Story 4. The summer of 1953 changed my life forever. I was just 12 years old then, all gangly limbs and boundless energy, working with my grandfather Earl aboard his fishing boat, the Verna May. That old 36-footer was our home through the salmon season, creaking and groaning as we navigated the chilly waters around Prince of Wales Island. I remember that night like it was yesterday, not almost 50 years ago. The memory hasn't faded one bit, not the sounds, not the smells, not the pure terror that shot through my body when I looked into those eyes. We'd had a good day's fishing. Grandpa Earl was pleased with our haul, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile as we counted our catch. "Well done, RB," he said, ruffling my hair with his calloused hand. "We'll make a fisherman out of you yet." After a dinner of canned beans and freshly caught salmon, Grandpa turned in early. He always said a fisherman needed his rest, and at 68 he needed it more than most. I stayed up a bit longer, flipping through a dog-eared comic book by lantern light until my eyelids grew heavy. Must have been close to midnight when I woke up needing to pee. The tiny cabin of the Verna May felt stuffy and close. Grandpa's snores filled the small space, rumbling like distant thunder. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly made my way to the deck. Didn't want to wake the old man just to use the head. The night was still, almost unnaturally so. No wind to speak of, just the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the occasional distant splash of a jumping fish. Our boat was anchored in a small cove, sheltered from the open waters. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light across the water, but the dense tree line along the shore remained a wall of impenetrable darkness. I moved to the starboard side, unzipping my pants, listening to the steady stream hitting the water below. That's when I felt it, a subtle shift in the boat's balance, like something heavy had climbed aboard on the port side. My first thought was that Grandpa had woken up and come to check on me, but there'd been no sound of the cabin door opening, no familiar creak of his old rubber boots on the deck. "Grandpa!" I called out, zipping up quickly. No answer. The boat rocked again, more noticeably this time. Heart hammering in my chest, I switched on my flashlight and slowly moved toward the port side. The beam of light shook with my trembling hand as I swept it across the deck. Nothing. Then I pointed it over the edge of the boat. What I saw in that moment froze the blood in my veins. A massive hand, if you could call it that, was gripping the gunwale, not a human hand, too large, covered in dark, matted hair, with long fingers ending in blackened nails or claws. I swung the flashlight upward and found myself staring directly into a face that still haunts my nightmares. It was pulled back in what looked like surprise, eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, like a deer caught in headlights. But these weren't deer eyes. They were dark, intelligent, and undeniably human-like, set deep in a face covered with thick, dark brown or black hair. The nose was broad and flat, the mouth a wide slash beneath it. For one eternal second, we stared at each other. Me, a scrawny 12-year-old boy, and this creature, its massive form half out of the water, half on our boat. Then it moved, faster than anything that big should be able to move. It released its grip and fell backward into the water with a splash that sent spray across my face. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight, a scream tearing from my throat. "Grandpa! Grandpa!" The cabin door burst open, and Grandpa Earl emerged, shotgun in hand, his eyes wild with sleep and confusion. "What is it, boy? What's wrong?" he demanded, scanning the deck. Words failed me. I could only point a shaking finger toward the water where the creature had disappeared. There was someone trying to climb aboard, I finally stammered. Grandpa moved to the side, his weathered face grave as he peered into the darkness. "Where'd it go?" "It fell back into the water when I shined my light on it." "What was it? A seal? Sea lion?" I shook my head violently. "No, it looked like a man, but not a man. Covered in hair, big, really big." Grandpa's skeptical look faded as he saw the genuine terror in my eyes. He knew I wasn't one for wild stories or exaggerations. "Stay here," he ordered, raising his shotgun, "and keep that light steady." We stood in silence, listening to the water lapping against the hull. Then Grandpa pointed toward the shore. "There, light it up, boy." I swung my flashlight toward where he was pointing, about 40 yards away, where the water met the tree line. The beam caught movement in the shallows. It rose from the water like some primordial beast, water cascading off its massive form, standing upright, on two legs. Even from that distance I could tell it was enormous. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, its body covered entirely in that same dark hair. It stood there for a moment as if making sure we were watching, then turned and walked, not lumbered or shambled, but walked, just like a man, straight into the forest. The trees swallowed it up, and it was gone. Grandpa lowered his shotgun slowly. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his hands were shaking nearly as bad as mine. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "Did you see that, RB? Tell me you saw that too." I nodded, unable to speak. Without another word, Grandpa turned and headed for the cabin. "We're moving now." "But it's gone, Grandpa," I said, finding my voice at last. "Don't care. We're not staying here." He fired up the engine, its rumble shattering the silence of the cove. I helped him pull up the anchor, my hands still trembling so badly I could barely grip the rope. Within minutes, we were chugging away from that accursed spot, heading for another anchorage miles down the coast. Grandpa didn't cut the engine until we were well away, in a small bay surrounded by open beach rather than dense forest. Even then, he kept his shotgun close, and neither of us slept a wink that night. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Grandpa finally spoke about what we'd seen. "My daddy used to tell stories," he said quietly, pouring us both cups of strong black coffee. "Stories the old Tlingit Indians told him, about the Kushtaka." "What's that?" I asked, wrapping my cold fingers around the tin mug. "Spirit creatures. Man-otters, they called them. Could change shape, trick fishermen." He shook his head. "Never believed those stories myself. Thought they were just meant to scare kids away from dangerous waters." "That wasn't no spirit, Grandpa," I said firmly. "I saw it clear as day. It was real, solid, and it wasn't no otter neither." Grandpa nodded slowly. No, it wasn't." He took a long sip of his coffee, staring out at the lightening horizon. Some of the loggers talk too, about big, hairy men in the forests. They call them different names. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. You think that's what it was? Don't know what it was, RB. Don't want to know neither. We finished our coffee in silence, the events of the night hanging between us like a physical presence. Over the next few days, we went about our business as usual, bringing in salmon, mending nets, maintaining the boat. But things had changed. We never anchored in secluded coves anymore, always choosing spots with good visibility and preferably near other fishing vessels. Grandpa kept his shotgun loaded and within reach at all times, and neither of us ventured onto the deck alone after dark. We never spoke of that night again, not to each other and certainly not to anyone else. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of every bar and bait shop from Ketchikan to Sitka. But we knew what we'd seen, and it changed us both. The rest of that summer passed without incident, and by the time we headed back to Ketchikan for the winter, the sharp edge of fear had dulled somewhat. But I never forgot. How could I? Years rolled by. I grew up, got stronger, taller, though never as tall as that thing I'd seen. After high school, I tried my hand at commercial fishing for a while, following in Grandpa Earl's footsteps. But the pull of the sea wasn't as strong for me as it had been for him. I found my calling in demolitions instead, the controlled destruction of rock and concrete, offering a satisfaction I couldn't find elsewhere. Grandpa passed on in '78, taking most of his stories with him. But not that one. That one lived on in me. I settled in Ketchikan, permanently built a life, made a name for myself in the demolition business. Got married, had kids, watched them grow, normal life stuff. But through it all, the memory of that night remained, tucked away but never forgotten. In all my years working on the water and in the Alaskan wilderness, and there were many, I never saw anything like that creature again. Not a glimpse, not a track, nothing. Sometimes I wondered if it had been real at all. Then came that day in 2000. I was 57 by then, with more grey than brown in my hair, and more aches than I cared to admit. I was having a drink at the Pioneer Bar in Ketchikan when I overheard a group of young fishermen talking, laughing about some crackpot who claimed to have seen a Bigfoot near Thorn Bay. "Probably just a bear standing up," one of them said dismissively. "Or too much whiskey," another added to general laughter. I sat there, nursing my beer, listening to them mock the idea, and something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the decades of keeping silent. Maybe it was the memory of Grandpa Earl's face that night, pale with fear, but also with the knowledge that he'd witnessed something extraordinary. Or maybe it was just the 3 beers I'd already put away. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing up and walking over to their table. "Mind if I join you, boys?" I asked. They looked up, taking in my weathered face, my calloused hands, the demolition company logo on my jacket. One of them nodded to an empty chair. "Sure, old-timer, pull up a seat." I sat down heavily, set my beer on the table, and looked each of them in the eye. "Couldn't help overhearing you talking about that Bigfoot sighting," I said. "And I thought you might like to hear a story, something that happened to me back in '53. They exchanged glances. Here we go, another crazy old man with tall tales, but they were polite enough to listen, or maybe just curious enough. So I told them exactly what I saw that night on the Verna May, the massive hairy hand gripping our boat, the face in the beam of my flashlight, the creature standing upright in the shallows before walking, not running, into the forest on 2 legs. I told them about Grandpa's fear, about moving anchorages in the middle of the night, about the shotgun that never left his side afterward. I didn't embellish, didn't need to. The truth was strange enough. When I finished, there was silence at the table. The youngest of the group, a red-headed kid who couldn't have been more than 20, broke it first. "Bullshit," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. I shrugged, took a sip of my beer. "Believe what you want. I know what I saw." "Why would something like that try to climb onto your boat?" asked another, his tone somewhere between skeptical and curious. "Don't know," I admitted. Maybe it was curious, maybe it was hungry, or maybe it mistook our boat for something else in the dark. "You ever see it again? Or anything like it?" I shook my head. "Never. Not in almost 50 years working these waters and forests. That was my one and only encounter." "You ever report it? Tell anyone besides us?" "Who would I tell? Fish and game? The police? Like your friend said, they'd just say it was a bear or too much whiskey." I drained the last of my beer. "Besides, Grandpa and I made a kind of unspoken agreement not to talk about it. Some things you just keep to yourself." "Until now," the redhead pointed out. I smiled faintly. "Until now. Guess at my age, I don't much care anymore what people think." They asked a few more questions, which I answered as honestly as I could. No, I didn't get a perfect look at its face. Yes, I was certain it walked on two legs like a man. No, it didn't make any sounds that I heard. Yes, I was scared out of my wits. Eventually, the conversation turned to other topics: fishing quotas, engine troubles, women problems, the usual bar talk. But I could tell my story had left an impression. They'd probably laugh about it later, chalk it up to the ramblings of an old man. But maybe, just maybe, the next time they anchored in a secluded cove near Prince of Wales Island, they'd think twice about going on deck alone at night. As for me, I've made my peace with what happened all those years ago. I don't expect to ever see such a creature again in my remaining years. Don't particularly want to, if I'm honest. But sometimes, when I'm out in my boat fishing, and the light hits the water just right, I find myself scanning the shoreline, looking for movement among the trees. And remembering that night when the natural world I thought I knew revealed itself to be far stranger, far more mysterious than I had ever imagined. That's my story, true as I'm sitting here. Make of it what you will. Story 5. The July evening couldn't have been more perfect. The summer air in Alaska had that special crispness to it, even in the height of the season. Not quite cold, but fresh enough to feel like it was cleaning out your lungs with each breath. Me, Bobby and Jen had just finished up the Eagle Crest Trail loop west of Juneau, a decent 6-mile trek that left us tired but satisfied. We'd planned this trip for weeks, a chance to escape our jobs in town and get back to nature for a night. "Hand me another beer, Chuck," Bobby called over as he poked at the campfire with a stick. The flames jumped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. I reached into the cooler behind me, ice water dripping down my wrist as I pulled out a can and tossed it his way. Bobby caught it with one hand, his reflexes still sharp despite the 2 beers he'd already finished. Jen sat cross-legged on a camp chair, her hiking boots kicked off, massaging her feet. "I think I'm getting a blister," she said, examining her heel in the firelight. "Worth it, though. That view at Eagle Point was something else." I nodded, cracking open my own beer. The carbonation hissed in the quiet. "Yeah, caught it right at sunset, too. Perfect timing." Our campsite wasn't anything fancy, just a small cleared area near where we'd parked the car, about 100 yards from the trailhead. The forest pressed in around us, tall pines and spruce trees casting long shadows in the firelight. There were official campgrounds closer to town, but we wanted something more remote, more authentic. Just us and the wilderness. "Anyone want a hot dog?" I asked, reaching for the pack we'd brought along. Bobby raised his hand. "I'm starving after that hike." I speared 2 hot dogs onto sticks and handed one to Bobby. We held them over the crackling fire, the meat beginning to sizzle. The smell of cooking food mingled with wood smoke. It was peaceful, perfect, until it wasn't. The first sign something was off came around 10 p.m. The summer sun had finally set, leaving us in that strange Alaskan twilight that never fully turns to darkness this time of year. Our fire had died down to a steady flame, not the roaring blaze we'd started with. We were trading stories, laughing, the kind of conversations that only seem to happen around campfires, when Jen suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her head cocked slightly. I listened. At first, just the normal forest sounds, the soft whisper of wind through trees, the distant call of some night bird. But then I heard it too. Shuffling footsteps. Something moving through the underbrush, not far away. "Probably just a deer," Bobby said, but the way his shoulders tensed told me he wasn't convinced. The shuffling continued, methodical, getting closer. Not the sound of an animal darting through brush, but something walking, deliberately. "Hey!" I called out, thinking maybe it was another hiker. "Hello? Someone there?" No response, just more shuffling now from about 25 feet away, at the edge of the light cast by our fire. Bobby stood up, grabbing his flashlight. "Hello?" he called louder than I had. The beam of light cut through the gloom, sweeping across trees and undergrowth, but caught nothing. Then the shuffling stopped. Complete silence fell over the forest. Even the night birds had gone quiet. "I don't like this," Jen whispered, standing up to move closer to us. That's when it stepped into the fringes of our firelight. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain tried to make sense of it. A bear, maybe, standing on its hind legs. But no, the proportions were all wrong. This thing stood upright like a man, about 6.5 feet tall, with impossibly broad shoulders. Its entire body was covered in thick black hair. "What the fuck is that?" Bobby hissed, his flashlight beam now fixed on the figure. The creature had one arm raised, held in front of its face like it was shielding its eyes from the fire. In the beam of Bobby's flashlight, its eyes caught the light and reflected back, first a bright whitish glow, then shifting to an unsettling reddish shine. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get out of here!" The thing made no sound. Not a grunt, not a growl, nothing. It just stood there for a moment, then took another step toward us, and another. In the strengthening firelight, I could make out more details, though part of me wished I couldn't. Its body was like some kind of great ape, muscular and powerful, covered entirely with that coarse black hair. But its face... Jesus, its face. The skin there was a sickly ash-grey color, hairless, stretched over a skull that was all wrong, too long, too narrow for anything human. "Guys," Jen's voice trembled beside me. "We need to go. Now." None of us moved, though. It was like we were frozen in place as this thing edged closer, now only about 15 feet away. Close enough that I caught its smell, a stench so foul it made my eyes water, like wet dog and garbage mixed together, left to rot in the sun. Bobby's flashlight beam shook as his hand trembled. "What the hell does it want?" The creature took another step. Then another. Its movements were fluid despite its massive size, purposeful. It wasn't charging us or acting aggressive, but its silent, relentless approach was somehow more terrifying than if it had been. That's when the spell broke. Jen let out a strangled cry and bolted toward the car. Bobby and I followed instantly, abandoning everything, our chairs, the cooler, our remaining food. I fumbled with the keys as we reached the vehicle, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them in the dirt. "Hurry, Chuck," Bobby yelled, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I snatched up the keys and hit the unlock button. The car's lights flashed, the beep seeming obscenely loud in the quiet forest. We piled in, me behind the wheel, Bobby in the passenger seat, Jen in the back. As I jammed the key into the ignition, Jen screamed, "It's coming!" I cranked the engine to life and threw the car into reverse, not even bothering to close my door yet. As I twisted around to look out the back window, I saw it, a massive handprint smeared in the dust on the rear glass. The fingers were unnaturally long, the palm broader than any human's could be. And beyond the print, illuminated in our brake lights, stood the creature. It hadn't rushed us or attacked. It just stood there, watching, that long grey face expressionless in the red glow. I slammed the car into drive and floored it. The tires spun on the dirt road before catching, and we shot forward, my door swinging shut from the momentum. I didn't slow down until we hit pavement 10 minutes later, and even then I kept the speedometer well above the limit all the way back to Juneau. None of us spoke much on that drive. What was there to say? We'd all seen it. We'd all smelled that ungodly stench. And we'd all felt that bone-deep fear, the kind that bypasses rational thought and plugs straight into the most primitive part of your brain. It was Bobby who finally broke the silence as the lights of Juneau came into view. "We're not telling anyone about this." It wasn't a question. Jen made a small noise from the back seat. They'd think we were crazy or drunk or both. "What do you think it was?" I asked, my knuckles still white on the steering wheel. Bobby shook his head. "I don't know, man, I really don't." But we all knew. None of us wanted to say the word out loud. It seemed too ridiculous, too tabloid headline absurd. But what else could it have been? No bear walks upright like that. No man has eyes that reflect red in the darkness or hands that could leave a print that size. I dropped Bobby off first, then Jen. We made awkward, half-hearted promises to talk the next day, but I knew we wouldn't. Some experiences you just want to bury, to pretend never happened. Back in my apartment, I stood under the shower for nearly an hour, trying to wash away the feeling of being watched. I kept replaying the encounter in my head. The steady, deliberate approach. The silence. Those reflective eyes. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak in my building, every shadow cast by passing car headlights, had me sitting upright, heart pounding. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with forests and footsteps and long grey faces watching me from the darkness. The next morning, I called in sick to work. My boss at the hardware store wasn't happy. Summer was their busy season. But I couldn't face the thought of small talk and normal life yet. Instead, I drove back out to our campsite. I told myself it was to collect our abandoned gear, but really, I needed to prove to myself that it had happened, that I hadn't imagined it all. The drive felt longer in daylight. Every curve in the road, every stretch of forest seemed to hide secrets now. I kept my windows rolled up tight despite the warming day. Our campsite looked undisturbed when I arrived. The fire had burned out, leaving just a black circle of ash. Our chairs sat where we'd left them. The cooler was tipped over, its contents strewn about, probably raided by actual wildlife after we'd fled. I approached cautiously, half expecting to find massive footprints in the dirt, but the ground was too hard-packed to show clear impressions. I gathered our things quickly, constantly scanning the tree line, the hair on the back of my neck standing up the entire time. The only real evidence was on my car, that handprint on the rear window, now dried and caked in the morning sun. I stared at it for a long time. The width of the palm was easily twice that of my own hand. The fingers splayed out like they'd been pressed hard against the glass. I didn't clean it off. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Over the next few days, I tried to return to normal life. I went back to work, smiled at customers, stocked shelves, and tried to convince myself that what we'd seen had a rational explanation. Maybe it was some hermit living in the woods, some mentally ill person covered in mud and leaves. Maybe it was an elaborate prank by locals targeting tourists, but I knew better. We all did. Bobby called me on the third day after it happened. His voice sounded rough, like he hadn't been sleeping either. "Have you looked online at all?" he asked without preamble. "About what?" But I knew. There are other reports, Chuck, from all over Alaska. People seeing things in the woods. The descriptions. They match what we saw. I sank down onto my couch, a cold feeling spreading through my chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we're not crazy. Or if we are, we're not the only ones." After we hung up, I did my own research. Bobby was right. There were dozens of reports from the Juneau area alone. Hikers, campers, even local residents on the outskirts of town, describing encounters with something that sounded eerily similar to what we'd seen. Some reports dated back decades. The locals had names for it. Kushtaka, though that wasn't quite right according to Tlingit mythology. Others called it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The names seemed almost comical compared to the reality of what we'd faced. The visceral terror of being watched by those eyes. A week passed, then 2. Jen texted occasionally, brief messages that never mentioned that night. Bobby and I met for beers once, talking around the subject until finally, after his 4th bottle, he leaned in close. "I'm moving back to Seattle," he said quietly. "Got a job offer. Good timing, I guess." I understood. Part of me wanted to leave too, to put as much distance as possible between myself and those woods, but something kept me in Juneau. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the need for answers, or maybe it was because I knew it wouldn't matter how far I ran. The memory of that thing would follow me anywhere. Summer faded into fall. The tourists thinned out and the days grew shorter. I stayed in town, working, living, trying to forget. But every time I drove past the turnoff to that trailhead, my heart would race, and I'd catch myself scanning the tree line. I never went hiking again. Not in Alaska, anyway. The forest that had once been a place of peace and escape now felt like a threat. A place where ancient eyes might be watching from behind every tree. Bobby left for Seattle as planned. Jen stuck around Juneau but found excuses whenever I suggested getting together. I didn't blame her. I was a walking reminder of something she wanted to forget. Sometimes, late at night, I'd find myself staring at online forums where people shared similar encounters. I read their stories with a sick fascination, recognizing the same fear that still woke me from sleep sometimes. The feeling of being stalked, of being watched by something intelligent but utterly inhuman. Most of the stories ended like ours, with people running, escaping, left with nothing but questions and nightmares. But some didn't. Some told of cabins broken into, of hunters gone missing. I couldn't know if those accounts were true, or just campfire stories grown in the telling. I didn't want to know. September 11th changed everything, not just for the country, but in some small way for me too. The horror on the news was so immediate, so human in its cause and impact, that it made my forest encounter seem distant and unreal by comparison. The world had bigger monsters now, ones that lived in daylight and walked among us. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or at least exaggerated it in my memory. Almost. But then came the October storm, a massive system that knocked out power across Juneau for nearly 3 days. My apartment building went dark along with the rest of my neighborhood. No heat, no light. Nothing but candles and battery-powered lanterns to hold back the early winter darkness. On the second night, I woke suddenly around 3 a.m. The building was quiet. Most of my neighbors had gone to stay with friends or family who had generators. I'd stayed stubborn as always. Something had pulled me from sleep, a sound maybe, or just that animal instinct that tells you you're not alone. I lay perfectly still in my bed, listening to the wind howl outside my window. Then I caught it, a smell, faint but unmistakable. That same fetid odor from the forest, wet dog and garbage. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Slowly I turned my head toward my bedroom window. The blinds were drawn, but a gap at the edge let in the faintest amount of ambient light from the city. And in that gap I saw the shadow of something massive move past. Then came a sound, the creak of my building's fire escape, metal groaning under significant weight. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally broke, I checked my building's exterior. The fire escape ran right past my bedroom window, and there, on the metal grating, I found tufts of coarse black hair caught in the joints of the stairs. I moved out of that apartment the next week. Found a place downtown, 4th floor, no fire escape, limited tree access. I told myself it was for the shorter commute to work. Almost a year has passed now since that night by the campfire. Life has a way of moving forward, of normalizing even the most abnormal experiences. I've gotten better at not thinking about it daily, at focusing on work, on friends, on the mundane details that make up a life. But I still wake up sometimes with my heart pounding, convinced I can smell that stench in my room. I still avoid the forests around Juneau, still scan the tree line when I'm driving the highway at dusk. And sometimes, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder about it, what it was, where it came from, why it approached us that night. Was it curious, territorial, something else entirely? I'll never know. What I do know is this: the wilderness isn't empty. The old stories, the legends told by indigenous people across this continent for thousands of years, they weren't just making things up. There are things in the deep woods that defy explanation, that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I know because I saw one, because it saw me. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, waiting for me to return to the woods it calls home. Story 6. My hands still shake when I type this. It's been 2 months since that night on the water. 2 months since my entire understanding of what exists in the Alaskan wilderness got turned on its head. I've been a commercial fisherman out of Sitka for nearly 25 years. My vessel, the Northern Star, is a sturdy 52-foot fishing boat that's weathered more storms than I care to count. I know these waters, or at least I thought I did. It happened on July 18th, 1979. We'd had a good day's haul near Cedar Pass, about 32 miles south of Sitka, on the western coast of Baranof Island. By evening, my crew, just 3 guys, Earl, Ronnie and Pete, were exhausted. We'd anchored about 100 yards from the shore. The dense forest of spruce and hemlock created a dark wall against the fading light. The mountains of Baranof rose steep behind them, disappearing into low clouds. "I'll take first watch," I told the boys around 9:30 p.m. "You all get some shut-eye. We're heading out at first light." They didn't argue, just nodded and retreated to their bunks in the forward cabin. I sat alone at the galley table with a cup of coffee, looking over charts for tomorrow. The gentle rocking of the boat against the anchor chain created a familiar rhythm. The cabin lights cast a yellow glow around me, and I'd left the starboard porthole open to let in the cool night air. The radio crackled with occasional chatter from other boats, but it was quiet otherwise. Just the sound of water lapping against the hull and the distant calls of nightbirds from the shoreline. The rich smell of pine drifted across the water. I'd been jotting notes in my logbook for about an hour. My coffee had gone cold, but I was still alert. The clock on the galley wall read 10:42 p.m. when it happened. First came a splash. Not a big one. Could have been a salmon jumping or a seal coming up for air. I didn't think much of it. Then a few minutes later, I heard heavy movement in the water. Sounded like something swimming, something big. I thought about grabbing the spotlight to see if a bear was taking a late-night swim, but before I could stand up, I felt it. A pressure on my right forearm. A grip. Something was holding my arm. I looked down and froze. The coffee mug slipped from my left hand and shattered on the floor. An arm, not human, but an arm nonetheless, had reached through the open porthole and was grasping my forearm. It was massive. Covered entirely in dark hair, maybe 4 inches long, black or dark brown, hard to tell in the cabin light. The hand at the end of this arm was palm up, wrapped around my forearm, in what I can only describe as a gentle hold. The fingers were huge, easily 3 times the size of my own. The skin on the palm was a dirty brownish grey, calloused and weathered. The fingers were long, the grip surprisingly careful, as if testing what I was. I could feel individual fingertips pressing against my skin. They weren't claws, they were fingers, but they weren't human. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, I sat paralyzed. My brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Then instinct kicked in. I yanked my arm away with a shout, not words, just a primal yell of fear. I stumbled backward off the bench, knocking over the table. The arm withdrew instantly through the porthole. "What the hell?" Earl's voice came from the forward cabin. I heard bunks creaking as the crew woke up. I couldn't speak yet. My breath came in gasps. I scrambled to my feet and slammed the porthole shut, locking it with trembling hands. "Harold, what's going on?" Ronnie appeared in the doorway, bleary-eyed but alarmed. "Start the engine," I managed to say. My voice sounded strange even to my own ears. "Now." "Pete, pull the anchor. We're moving." "Moving? It's the middle of the night," Pete protested, appearing behind Ronnie. "Do it now," I snapped, my eyes fixed on the closed porthole. "There's something out there." Earl pushed past the others. "What did you see?" "I didn't just see it," I said, rubbing my forearm where I could still feel the touch. "It grabbed me." The crew exchanged glances, but they knew me well enough not to argue. Within minutes, Ronnie had the engines rumbling to life, and Pete was on deck pulling the anchor. "What was it, boss?" Earl asked quietly while the others worked. "Bear." I shook my head. "No bear, not unless they've got arms 3 feet long with hands the size of dinner plates." I described what I'd seen and felt. Earl's face went pale. "Shit, Harold. You're talking about a... I don't know what I'm talking about." I cut him off. "Let's just move." We navigated carefully in the darkness, traveling about 5 miles up the channel before dropping anchor again. None of us mentioned what we were all thinking. I ordered double watch that night, 2 men awake at all times, all portholes closed despite the stuffy heat. The rest of the night passed without incident. When morning came, we pulled anchor early and headed out to our fishing grounds as planned. In the harsh light of day, the crew started making jokes. "Harold got felt up by the creature from the Black Lagoon," Pete said, earning nervous laughter. "I didn't join in. The memory of that hairy arm, the careful grip of those massive fingers, was too vivid, too real." After a full day of fishing, we returned to port in Sitka the following evening. I didn't tell anyone else about the incident right away. Who would believe it? A seasoned fisherman claiming a monster reached through his porthole and grabbed him? I'd be the laughingstock of the harbor. But the experience gnawed at me. A week later, I found myself at Mike's bar, talking to Jim Garland, an old-timer who'd spent his life in the forests of southeast Alaska. After a few beers, I told him what happened. I expected ridicule. Instead, Jim nodded slowly. "Cedar Pass, you said?" "Yeah, about half a mile from the northern point. There have been stories from that area. Loggers mostly, few hunters. They don't usually report officially. Bad for business and reputation, you understand." "Stories about what, exactly?" I asked, though I already knew. Jim looked around the bar, then lowered his voice. "The Tlingit call them Kushtaka. Others call them Sasquatch, bush apes. Whatever name you use, people have seen them for generations in these parts." "I didn't just see it," I reminded him. "It touched me." Jim rubbed his grizzled chin. "That's rarer. They usually avoid direct contact." "It wasn't aggressive," I admitted. "That's the strangest part. It was almost curious." The conversation with Jim didn't provide answers, but it convinced me I wasn't crazy. Over the next month, I quietly asked around, collected stories. Most were vague: shadows moving between trees, unexplained footprints, strange calls in the night. But a few, like mine, involved direct sightings. 3 weeks after the incident, I took the Northern Star back to Cedar Pass, alone this time. The crew thought I was nuts and refused to join me. Can't say I blamed them. I anchored in the same spot around noon, broad daylight. I sat on deck with binoculars and a camera, watching the shoreline for hours. Nothing happened. The dense forest revealed no secrets. As evening approached, I started the engines and left. I wasn't brave enough to spend another night there. Since then, I've changed my habits. I don't anchor close to shore anymore, especially not near Cedar Pass. I keep all portholes closed at night, no matter how hot it gets in the cabin. Some nights I wake up sweating, feeling phantom fingers on my arm. I've replayed those few seconds 1,000 times in my mind. The gentle grip, the immediate release when I pulled away, the way it retreated without aggression. What was it doing? Investigating? Trying to communicate? Or was it planning to pull me through that porthole if I hadn't reacted? Last week, I finally filed a report with a wildlife researcher from the University of Alaska who was passing through Sitka. He took detailed notes and asked smart questions without judgment. He showed me cast footprints collected from northern Vancouver Island in '76 and Admiralty Island in '74, enormous human-like feet with 5 toes, just much bigger than any person's. I know what I experienced that night. I know what reached through my porthole and grabbed my arm. The memory of that touch, skin against fur, human against something else, is burned into my brain and body. When I fish the western coast of Paranoia Island now, I keep my eyes on the shoreline. Sometimes I think I see movement among the trees, a shadow too tall, too broad to be human, but it's always gone when I look directly. The locals have a saying, "The Alaskan wilderness doesn't give up its secrets easily." Before that night at Cedar Pass, I thought I knew these waters, these forests. Now I understand how little I actually know. Whatever reached through my porthole that night, it shares these islands with us. It moves through the forests we log, swims in the waters we fish, and watches from shores we thought we understood. I don't tell this story to many people. Most would think I'm crazy or looking for attention, but I know what I felt. A massive, hairy arm with a hand 3 times human size, covered in thick brown-black hair, reaching into my boat and gently grasping my arm. I don't anchor near Cedar Pass anymore. None of the local fishermen do if they've heard my story. The forest there is particularly dense, running right to the shoreline. Perfect cover for something large that doesn't want to be seen. Sometimes at night, when I'm anchored far from shore in open water, I still hear splashes that don't sound like fish or seals. I keep my portholes closed and pretend it's just my imagination, but I know better now. I know what's out there. Story 7. The wind howled across Summit Mountain like a hungry animal. October in the Yukon doesn't forgive mistakes, and Kevin and I had made a big one. The temperature gauge on my old Ford F-150 read 12 degrees below freezing as we fishtailed on black ice hidden beneath fresh powder. I felt the rear wheels lose traction first, then the steering wheel became useless in my hands. "Hold on!" I shouted to Kevin as we slid sideways toward the shoulder. The truck plunged into a snowbank with a sickening crunch of metal and plastic. The engine died immediately. Silence followed, broken only by our heavy breathing and the relentless wind battering the windows. "You okay, Will?" Kevin asked, adjusting his baseball cap. "Yeah," I replied, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Damn it. We were about 40 miles from Haines Junction on the Haines Highway. The snowstorm had caught us by surprise. The forecast had called for light flurries, not this blizzard. Cell service was non-existent. The dashboard clock read 3:17 p.m. Daylight was already fading. "We should start digging," I said, "before it gets dark." Kevin nodded grimly. We bundled up in our heavy winter gear, insulated Carhartt coveralls, thick gloves and wool hats. The temperature bit at my face the moment I opened the door. Wind-driven snow pelted my cheeks like tiny needles. The truck had plunged nearly 2 feet into the snowbank. The front right tire was completely buried, the rear left suspended slightly off the ground. We grabbed the emergency shovels from behind the seat and began digging. The work was brutal. Every shovelful of snow was immediately replaced by fresh powder blowing across the highway. Sweat built up under my layers despite the cold. My breath came in visible puffs that were whisked away by the wind. "This is useless," Kevin grunted after 45 minutes of digging. "We need traction." We gathered pine branches and rocks, stuffing them under the wheels. I tried starting the engine. The tires spun uselessly, spraying our makeshift traction aids into the air. Hours passed. The daylight dimmed to a grayish dusk. We took turns warming up in the truck while the other continued digging. The clock read 5:35 p.m. when Kevin suddenly stopped shoveling. "Will," he said, his voice strange, "look up there." I straightened, following his gaze toward a rocky bluff about 50 yards away. At first I saw nothing against the darkening sky and swirling snow. Then I spotted it, a dark silhouette standing upright on the edge of the outcropping, human-shaped but somehow wrong. "Is that a person?" I asked, squinting through the snow. The figure didn't move like a person. It stood completely still, watching us. Even from this distance, I could tell it was tall, around 6 feet, but with proportions that seemed off. Its arms hung too long at its sides. The body looked bulky, but not from clothing. "Hey!" Kevin shouted, waving his arms. "We need help! Our truck is stuck!" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. Kevin muttered a curse. "I don't like this." He reached into the truck bed and pulled out his machete, a tool we'd brought for clearing brush at his hunting cabin, our original destination. Without warning, he started charging up the slope toward the bluff. "Kevin! What the hell?" I called after him. He ignored me, trudging through knee-deep snow, waving the machete over his head and shouting, "Get out of here! Go on! Get!" The figure on the bluff watched Kevin's approach for a few seconds, then simply turned and walked away on 2 legs. It disappeared over the summit with a casual ease that made my skin crawl. No person should move that smoothly through deep snow at that elevation. Kevin stopped halfway up the slope, watching where the figure had vanished. He stood there for a full minute before trudging back down to the truck. "What was that about?" I demanded when he returned, breathing heavily. "Thought it might be a bear," he panted, "standing up. But it wasn't. Walked away on 2 legs. Could have been a hiker," I suggested, not believing it myself. Kevin shook his head. "No backpack, no proper gear. And did you see how it moved? Too smooth. Too quiet." We returned to digging, both of us glancing frequently at the bluff. The light was fading fast now. We had maybe 30 minutes of workable visibility left. "Will," Kevin said suddenly, his voice tight. "It's back." I looked up at the bluff again. My heart seemed to stop. Standing almost exactly where the first figure had been was something much larger. Even from 50 yards away, its size was undeniable. It stood at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders spanning over 3 feet wide. The fading light and falling snow made details difficult, but I could clearly see dark hair covering its body. Long hair, maybe 8 to 10 inches in length, whipping in the wind. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. Unlike the first figure, this one moved. It bobbed up and down in place, swaying slightly, like a linebacker preparing to blitz. The movement was deliberate, aggressive, threatening. "Kevin," I said, my mouth dry, "get in the truck, now." "I can scare it off," he said, gripping the machete tighter. "No, look at the size of that thing. Get in the truck, now." For once, Kevin didn't argue. We backed slowly toward the truck, never taking our eyes off the massive figure on the bluff. It continued its bobbing motion, watching us retreat. We climbed into the truck and locked the doors. I started the engine to get the heater running. The creature remained on the bluff, still moving in that same unsettling way. "What the hell is that?" Kevin whispered. "I don't know," I lied. I had a suspicion growing in my mind, but it seemed too ridiculous to voice. We sat in silence for 20 minutes, watching the figure on the bluff. Eventually it stopped its bobbing motion and stood perfectly still again, just watching. The snowfall intensified, and visibility dropped. When I could no longer make out the bluff through the swirling white, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. "It could still be out there," Kevin said, "watching us." "I know," I replied. The temperature continued to drop. The truck's heater fought against the cold seeping through the windows. We took inventory of our supplies: half a thermos of coffee, 4 granola bars, 2 bottles of water, and a nearly empty bag of beef jerky. Enough for the night if we had to stay. "We need to keep digging," I said, after we'd sat in silence for an hour. "We can't stay here all night. We'll freeze if the gas runs out." Kevin nodded grimly. "I'll go first. Keep the engine running. Watch for whatever that was." He zipped his jacket up to his chin and stepped out into the storm. I kept my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the reach of our headlights. Kevin worked furiously, clearing snow from around the tires. After 15 minutes, I joined him. We dug in shifts, one person working while the other watched our surroundings. The snow continued falling. The wind howled. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound that wasn't the wind made us freeze and scan the darkness. After another hour of digging, we had cleared substantial space around the tires. "Let's try it again," Kevin suggested. I slid behind the wheel while Kevin positioned himself to push. I revved the engine and felt the tires spin, then catch. The truck lurched forward 6 inches, then stopped. "Again!" Kevin shouted through the window. I tried again. The truck moved another foot, then settled back into the snow. "We need more traction," I called out to him. Kevin started gathering more pine branches when a sound cut through the howling wind. A deep, throaty vocalization that was neither human nor any animal I recognized. It echoed off the mountain faces around us, making it impossible to pinpoint the direction. Kevin sprinted back to the truck and jumped inside, slamming the door. "Did you hear that?" he asked, wide-eyed. "Yeah," I nodded, scanning the darkness beyond our headlights. I heard it. The sound came again, longer this time. A sustained howl that started low and rose in pitch before dropping again. It reverberated through my chest like bass from a powerful speaker. "That's no coyote," Kevin whispered. "No wolf either." "No," I agreed. "It's not." We sat in tense silence, listening. The sound didn't repeat, but the absence of it was almost worse. We knew something was out there, watching, waiting. The dashboard clock read 9:23 p.m. when we saw headlights approaching from the direction of Haines Junction. Relief flooded through me as a massive snowplow rumbled into view. I flashed my lights and honked. The plow slowed as it approached, its massive blade pushing snow effortlessly. The driver, a burly man in his 50s with a thick grey beard, climbed down from the cab. "You boys picked a hell of a night for a drive," he called as he trudged through the snow toward us. "Engine trouble," I lied, not wanting to explain about the figures on the bluff. Then we slid off the road. The driver, who introduced himself as Earl, inspected our situation. "I can pull you out with a chain. Should be easy enough." As Earl returned to his plow to retrieve a tow chain, Kevin grabbed my arm. "Should we tell him?" I hesitated. "Tell him what? That we saw Bigfoot? He'll think we're crazy or drunk." "But what if that thing is still out there? What if it comes after him too?" Before I could respond, Earl returned with a heavy chain. He worked efficiently, securing one end to his plow and the other to my truck's frame. "Did you see anything unusual tonight?" Kevin asked him as he worked. "Any wildlife or anything?" Earl straightened up. "Funny you should ask. Saw some mighty strange tracks about 5 miles back, too big for a bear, wrong shape anyway, and they were walking tracks, not running." Kevin and I exchanged glances. "You boys see something?" Earl asked, noticing our reaction. "Maybe," I admitted. "Up on that bluff. Something big, walking on 2 legs." Earl was quiet for a moment, his face unreadable in the reflected glare of the headlights. "Lots of strange things in these mountains," he finally said, "especially during storms. Best not to dwell on it." He returned to his plow and slowly pulled us free from the snowbank. Once we were back on the road, he gave us directions to the nearest town with a motel. "Stay on the main road," he advised, before climbing back into his plow. "And I wouldn't stop again until you reach town. Storm's getting worse." We thanked him, and he continued on his route, the plow disappearing into the swirling snow. Kevin and I sat in silence for a moment. "We should go," I said finally, putting the truck in gear. Kevin nodded but kept looking back at the bluff. "Will, what did we see back there?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I don't know, Kevin, but whatever it was watching us, and it wasn't human." We drove carefully through the storm, following the freshly plowed path. Neither of us spoke much. The events of the evening replayed in my mind, the first figure, slightly taller than a man, walking away when confronted. The second figure, massive and intimidating, displaying what felt unmistakably like territorial aggression. About 20 miles down the road, as we descended from the mountain pass, Kevin finally broke the silence. "It was a Sasquatch, wasn't it? 2 of them." I considered denying it, offering some rational explanation. But the image of that 9-foot figure bobbing menacingly on the bluff was burned into my mind. "Yeah," I admitted, "I think it was." "The second one came after I chased the first," Kevin said quietly, "like it was protecting the smaller one." The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Maybe family, parent and child, or something like that. We reached the small town of Pleasant Valley around 11:30 p.m. and found a motel with vacancy. As we checked in, the elderly woman at the front desk commented on the dangerous driving conditions. "You boys are lucky," she said. "Highway's closed now. They're saying it's the worst October storm in 15 years. In our room, Kevin and I struggled to process what we'd experienced. We agreed to tell no one else. Who would believe us anyway? But we knew what we'd seen. 2 creatures walking upright, one showing clear protective aggression toward the other. In the remote Canadian Yukon, we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist according to science, but clearly did. I lay awake most of that night, listening to the storm batter the motel windows. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by those creatures on the bluff, the calculating intelligence I'd sensed in the larger one's behavior. It hadn't attacked, though it clearly could have. It had warned us, established its territory, protected the smaller one. In the morning, Kevin and I continued our journey, but something had changed. The wilderness around us no longer seemed empty. The dense forests flanking the highway held secrets, inhabitants that remained hidden, watching from the shadows. I found myself scanning the tree line as we drove, half expecting to glimpse a tall, dark figure moving among the pines. I know what I saw that day in October 2004. No bear, no hiker, no trick of light or snow. We encountered 2 Sasquatch in that remote mountain pass. They let us leave their territory, and not a day goes by that I don't wonder if they're still there, watching from the bluffs as travelers pass below, unaware of what lurks just beyond the reach of their headlights. Story 8. I couldn't sleep. The camping trip had been going great until that night. Me, Jake, and the Collins brothers had picked a decent spot above Upper Campbell Lake. The weather on Vancouver Island had cooperated all day. Warm enough to swim, but not so hot we were miserable setting up camp. I should have been sleeping like the dead after hiking all day, but something kept waking me. The first time, I thought I'd imagined it. A small tapping sound against the nylon of my tent. The second time, I sat up. Definitely something small, hitting the tent from the direction of the forested slope above us. I lay back down, figuring it was just pine cones dropping or maybe the start of a light rain. The third time, I heard the distinct sound of a pebble hitting the rain fly, then rolling down. I checked my watch, 2:17 a.m. I groaned and put my pillow over my head. When it happened a fourth time, 3 minutes later, I sat up fully. This wasn't random. The stones were coming at regular intervals from the same direction. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my boots, and unzipped the tent as quietly as possible. The night air hit my face, cool and damp, with that distinctive Vancouver Island forest smell, a mix of pine, damp earth, and something vaguely salty from the not-too-distant ocean. Jake and the Collins boys were still sleeping soundly in their tents. The campfire had died down to glowing embers that cast just enough light for me to see the basic outlines of our campsite. I stepped out, flashlight still off, and listened. Silence. Not even the normal forest sounds seemed present. Then, a soft rustling from the slope above, followed by another small stone that landed about 2 feet to my right. "Hello?" I called out, not too loud. No response. I switched on my flashlight and directed it toward the forest edge about 30 feet away. Nothing visibly unusual. Just the second-growth trees, mostly Douglas fir and western hemlock, standing like sentinels at the perimeter of our clearing. Annoyed now, I began walking toward where I thought the stones were coming from. As a physical therapist with an anthropology background, I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that most animals avoid human camps. Bears sometimes get curious about food, but they don't typically throw stones to get attention. I reached the tree line and swept my flashlight in a slow arc across the forest. The beam caught some movement about 20 feet in. "Whoever's there, quit messing around," I called, directing my light toward the movement. What I saw next stopped my breath. Standing between 2 large trees, partially obscured by undergrowth but unmistakably present, was a figure. Not a human figure. Something else entirely. My flashlight beam illuminated a massive 7-foot-tall creature covered in long, dark hair. The hair had a distinct reddish tinge where the light hit it directly, not the pure black of a bear. Its broad shoulders must have been at least 3 feet across. It stood upright on 2 legs, completely vertical in a way no bear could maintain. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably less than 3 seconds. The creature's face remained in shadow, but I could make out the distinct outline of a head that sat directly on those massive shoulders, no visible neck. Its arms hung at its sides, impossibly long, with hands that extended well past mid-thigh. But what struck me most were the legs. As a physical therapist, I automatically assessed the musculature. This thing had quadriceps that extended at least 3.5 feet from hip to knee, powerfully developed muscles that no human athlete could match. The moment was shattered when the creature suddenly pivoted. The movement was shockingly fast for something so large. It turned and plunged deeper into the forest, moving with purpose and surprising agility. I heard branches snapping and undergrowth crushing beneath its weight as it retreated. The sound of its departure continued for maybe 15 seconds, growing fainter until the forest fell silent again. I stood frozen, flashlight still pointed at the now empty space between the trees. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd seen enough bears in my life to know this wasn't one. Black bears don't stand 7 feet tall on their hind legs. They don't have that build, that hair color, or move that way. And their legs certainly don't have that kind of musculature. My anthropology studies flashed through my mind. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, primates. Nothing in the scientific catalogues I'd studied matched what I'd just seen. Sasquatch. The word formed in my mind even as I tried to reject it. I was a rational person with scientific training. I didn't believe in cryptids or monsters, yet what I'd just witnessed defied any other explanation. I backed away from the tree line, keeping my flashlight trained on the forest. When I reached the campfire, I added more wood, building it back up to a decent blaze. I settled on a log beside it, my mind racing. Should I wake the others? What would I tell them? That I'd seen a legendary creature that most scientists insisted didn't exist? I could already hear Jake's laughter, see the Collins brothers exchanging those looks they give when they think someone's pulling their leg. When the sun finally began to lighten the eastern sky around 5:30 a.m., I was still sitting by the fire, running through all possible explanations. A bear standing oddly? No. A man in a suit? Out here, miles from the nearest road? Unlikely. My imagination fueled by fatigue and the strange setting. I knew what I'd seen. Jake emerged from his tent first, yawning and scratching his beard. "You're up early," he said, reaching for the coffee pot. "Yeah," I replied. "Had a visitor last night." "Oh yeah, what kind?" I hesitated. "Just a curious bear. Nothing to worry about. It took off when I shined my light on it." Jake nodded, unsurprised. "They get pretty bold around campsites sometimes. Probably smelled our dinner." "Probably," I agreed, relieved he didn't ask for details. The Collins brothers woke soon after, and the day progressed normally. We hiked, fished, told the same old stories we always did on these trips. But my mind kept returning to those few seconds at the forest edge. That night, I insisted we build the fire bigger. No one questioned it. I volunteered for the first watch, then the second. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I told the guys I wasn't feeling well, stomach issues, and suggested we cut the trip short by a day. They grumbled, but agreed. We packed up camp and hiked back to where we'd left our trucks. On the drive home, I stopped at the ranger station and hesitated outside. I could report what I'd seen, but what would I say? That I'd seen a Sasquatch? I already knew how that conversation would go. The ranger would be polite but dismissive. There would be paperwork, maybe follow-up questions. My name might get passed around as that guy who thinks he saw Bigfoot. In my profession, that kind of reputation could be damaging. I got back in my truck and drove home. For weeks afterward, I researched everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings on Vancouver Island. Most accounts were clearly hoaxes or misidentifications, but some, a few, contained details so similar to what I'd seen that they sent chills down my spine. I read about Dr. John Bindernagel, a wildlife biologist who had devoted years to studying Sasquatch evidence scientifically. His approach was measured, careful, and distinctly unsensationalistic, but I didn't reach out to him. I told no one about what I'd seen. Life went on. I built my physical therapy practice. I continued camping and hiking, though never again at Upper Campbell Lake. Sometimes when I was in the forest alone, I'd feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if being watched. I'd turn quickly, hoping, or perhaps fearing, to catch another glimpse of what I'd seen that night, but there was never anything there. Years passed. Then one day in 1992, I read a small article in the Vancouver Island newspaper. Dr. Bindernagel had discovered and cast a footprint near Gold River, about 15 kilometers from where we'd camped that night in '75. The print measured 17 inches long with 5 distinct toes. Not the typical fake prints with their oversized, cartoon-like appearance. The cast showed subtle details that would be extremely difficult to fake, including pressure ridges and a mid-tarsal break consistent with a flexible, non-human foot. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the grainy newspaper photo of Dr. Bindernagel holding the plaster cast. Scientific validation of a sort. Not proof positive, but evidence that I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. I almost called the number listed in the article. Almost. But what would I say after all these years? I saw something too, back in '75. Without physical evidence, my account was just another story. Instead, I clipped the article and tucked it into a folder in my desk. In the summer of 1997, I found myself with a week off and an urge to go fishing. Jake had moved to Oregon years before, and the Collins brothers were both married with kids now, too busy for impromptu camping trips. So I went alone, choosing a spot near Buttle Lake, not far from my 1975 encounter site. I set up camp efficiently, the routine familiar after decades of outdoor trips. As darkness fell, I built a larger fire than I needed and sat beside it with a mug of coffee, listening to the forest sounds. Around midnight, I heard it, the soft sound of a small stone landing on the ground near my tent. Then another. My heart rate doubled instantly. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked to the edge of my campsite. "I know you're there," I said, not loudly but clearly enough to carry into the trees. "I remember you from Upper Campbell Lake. 22 years ago. Silence answered me. I waited, flashlight in hand but not switched on. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then came a sound, a soft, rhythmic whooshing that might have been heavy breathing, or might have been the wind in the trees. It lasted for perhaps 10 seconds, then faded. I never shined my light into the forest that night. I didn't need to. I knew what was there, and somehow I felt it knew me too. I returned to my fire and added more wood. I stayed awake until dawn, but there were no more stones, no more strange sounds. The next morning, I packed up and left. I've never returned to that part of Vancouver Island. I'm older now. My hair has gone grey, and my knees protest when I climb the stairs. I still practice physical therapy, though I've cut back my hours. I still go camping, but in more accessible places with proper facilities. The folder with Dr. Bindernagel's article has grown thicker over the years. More reports, more studies, more evidence that what I saw was real. Sometimes I think about contacting other researchers, telling my story. But then I remember Jake's face when I mentioned the curious bear. How easily he accepted that explanation, how uncomplicated it made everything. And I wonder if some experiences are better left unshared, existing in that grey space between known and unknown. But on cold nights, when the wind rattles my windows, I remember those few seconds at the forest edge, the massive figure with reddish-tinged dark hair, the powerful leg muscles, the sudden pivot and retreat into the trees. Not a bear, not a man, something else entirely, and I know what I saw. Story 9. The winter of 1964 was particularly harsh in Clairwalk. The wind howled through the tall spruce trees surrounding our little market at the edge of the lagoon. My husband Tom and I had opened Lesk Market just 3 years earlier, a modest grocery serving the scattered families of our remote Alaskan community. With 2 young ones, Mikey, just turning 4, and Sarah, barely 18 months, running the store while raising babies wasn't easy. But we managed. I can still picture our store clearly, wooden floors that creaked with every step, 6 short aisles of canned goods, dry supplies, and basic necessities. A small meat counter in the back where Tom would cut fresh salmon and venison for the locals. The large front windows that looked out toward the dense forest line, maybe 50 yards from our porch. The sign above the door, hand-painted by Tom's father, Lesk Market, since 1961. It all started on a Tuesday night in late January. The snow had been falling steadily all day, piling up against the sides of the building. Tom was in the back storeroom, taking inventory and organizing our next supply order. We'd stay open until 9, but rarely saw customers after 7 during winter months. I had put the kids to bed in our living quarters, attached to the back of the store. With business slow, I decided to mop the floors while Tom finished his paperwork. I propped the front door open with a brick, something I often did while mopping, to let the ammonia smell dissipate despite the cold. The forest air smelled of pine and snow, crisp and clean. I was halfway through the 3rd aisle when I heard it. Giggling. Unmistakable children's laughter. "Damn it," I muttered, dropping the mop against a shelf. The kids were supposed to be asleep. They'd been doing this lately, sneaking out of bed, coming to play in the store after hours. "Mikey, Sarah, you two better get back to bed right now," I called out, not too loudly, not wanting Tom to hear and get upset. He was strict about bedtimes. More giggling, coming from the candy aisle. I sighed and walked toward the sound, ready to scoop up my children and march them back to bed. But when I turned the corner, what I saw made me freeze in place. Mikey stood in his pajamas, extending a candy bar toward the end of the aisle. Sarah sat on the floor, clapping her hands. But it wasn't my children that stopped me cold. It was what stood at the end of the aisle, a small figure, maybe 3 feet tall, covered entirely in black hair. In the dim store lighting, I could make out 2 eyes reflecting back at me, like a deer caught in headlights. The thing, and I didn't know what else to call it, stood perfectly still for just a second. Then it bolted, running on two legs, straight out the open front door and into the darkness. I rushed to my children, scooping them up, one under each arm, and ran to the door, kicking the brick away to let it slam shut. My heart pounded as I locked the deadbolt. "What was that, Mommy?" Mikey asked, still clutching the candy bar. "Nothing, sweetie. Just an animal that got in. A lost baby bear, maybe," I said, knowing full well it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright like that. Bears don't have those eyes, and bears hibernate in January. I put the kids back to bed, telling them not to mention the animal to their father. Tom would just worry, and he had enough on his mind with the store barely breaking even that winter. For 3 nights afterward, I kept the door firmly shut while cleaning. But by the following week, I'd convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Stress and exhaustion playing tricks on me. So when I mopped on Monday night, I propped the door open again, welcoming the fresh air. At first, nothing happened. The clock ticked past 11. Tom had gone to bed early with a headache, leaving me to finish the books and clean up. I was almost done when I heard my children again. This time, I didn't call out. I set down my mop quietly and crept toward the sound. Aisle 4, where we kept the cookies and crackers. I peered around the end cap. There they were. Mikey was sitting cross-legged on the floor, Sarah beside him. Across from them, maybe 5 feet away, sat the hair-covered figure. In the better lighting of this aisle, I could see more details. It wasn't just black hair, more of a dark brown, thick and matted. Small hands, almost human-like but with longer fingers, were picking through a box of animal crackers Mikey had apparently offered. I must have made some small noise, because all 3 heads turned toward me simultaneously. The hairy child, because that's what it seemed to be, leapt to its feet and darted down the aisle, disappearing around the corner. I heard the padding of feet across the wooden floor, and then silence. "He likes the elephant ones best," Mikey informed me, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. I checked the store thoroughly that night, searching every corner and crevice. Nothing. Whatever had visited was gone, back to the forest. Over the next 2 months it happened 6 more times, always after midnight, always when Tom was asleep or in another part of the store, always with the door propped open. The pattern became so regular that I began to anticipate it, though I never told a soul. By March, I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. There weren't words for what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear cub, I knew that much. It moved too deliberately, its actions too intelligent. It wasn't a child in a costume. We were miles from the nearest neighbor with kids, and no one would send their child into the night woods in the Alaskan winter. On the 3rd visit, I'd worked up the courage to stay in place rather than frightening it away. The children treated it like a playmate, showing it toys they'd brought from their room. It seemed especially fascinated by Sarah's jack-in-the-box, jumping back when the clown popped out, then cautiously approaching to touch it with long, nimble fingers. By the 5th visit, I'd taken to leaving snacks out. Cookies, fruit, once even a sandwich. These would disappear during the encounters. The creature, I didn't know what else to call it, never made any sounds I could hear beyond soft breathing and occasional quick exhales that might have been its version of laughter. The last visit came in early April, as the snow was beginning to melt. That night, I deliberately mopped with the door open, even though the floors weren't particularly dirty. Tom had gone to bed early with the fishing almanac he studied religiously. I heard the children's door open around 12:30. Their soft footsteps padded across the store. I continued mopping, pretending not to notice. Then came the giggling, the whispers, the sound of a cereal box being opened. Slowly I made my way toward aisle 2. The 3 of them sat in a circle, my 2 children and the creature. That night I noticed something new. It wore what looked like a crude necklace of twisted roots or vines, with several dark objects hanging from it, stones perhaps or seeds. For nearly 15 minutes, I watched them play. The creature showed my children how to stack cereal pieces in towers. Mikey taught it patty cake. Though its coordination wasn't quite right for the game, there was something so innocent about the interaction that my initial fear had long since turned to curiosity. When I finally stepped into view, the creature looked up. This time, it didn't immediately flee. It stared at me, its dark eyes reflecting the store lights. I raised my hand slowly, offering a small wave. It tilted its head, then raised its own hand in what seemed like a mimicked greeting. Then it turned, scampered down the aisle, and disappeared into the night. That was the last time it came. 2 weeks later, we received news that Tom's father had died unexpectedly in Juneau. We closed the store temporarily, traveling south for the funeral. When we returned, something had changed. Perhaps our routine disruption had broken whatever pattern had allowed these strange encounters. Perhaps the warming spring weather altered the creature's habits or territory. I kept the door closed during cleaning after that, partly out of a new caution after being away, partly because I worried about bears becoming active again with the thaw. The children asked about their fuzzy friend for a while, but eventually, like all young children, they moved on to other interests and seemingly forgot. Life continued. The store thrived as tourism picked up through the 70s and 80s. Mikey grew up and moved to Anchorage, becoming an accountant. Sarah stayed closer, teaching at the elementary school in Craig. Tom and I grew older alongside our little market. I never told anyone about those winter visits. Not Tom, not my friends at church, not even my own children once they were grown. Who would believe me? In a place where people already told tales of monsters in the woods, I didn't want to be another crazy story passed around at the bar. By the time 2004 rolled around, I was 72 and sick. The cancer had started in my lungs. 40 years of cigarettes will do that, and spread to my liver and bones. The doctors in Ketchikan gave me 3 months. I made it 5 out of sheer stubbornness. As I lay in the hospital bed in my final week, my old friend Martha Davis came to visit daily. Martha and I had been friends for nearly 30 years, ever since she moved up from Washington. On her 3rd visit that week, she brought forget-me-nots from her garden and placed them in a plastic cup by my bed. "These might be the last batch this season," she said, adjusting them. "First frost came early this year." Something about those words, about things ending, about seasons changing, broke open a door I'd kept locked for 40 years. "Martha," I said, my voice raspy from the oxygen tubes, "I need to tell you something, something I've never told anyone." She pulled her chair closer, taking my hand in hers. "What is it, Ellie?" I told her everything. The midnight visits, the hairy child, my own children playing with something from the woods. I described every detail I could remember. The matted dark hair, the reflecting eyes, the almost human hands, the necklace of roots and stones. When I finished, I expected skepticism or concern. Instead, Martha nodded slowly. "The Tlingit have stories," she said quietly, "about the Kushtaka, the land otter people, and there are the miners' tales about the bushman." "It wasn't those things," I interrupted. "It wasn't trying to trick anyone or hurt my children. It was just curious, like a child." Martha squeezed my hand. "The old people say there are many things in these woods that we don't understand, that we aren't meant to understand." "Do you think I imagined it?" I asked. "All those years I wondered if I was going crazy." "I think," Martha said carefully, "that you saw something real, something few people ever see." "A juvenile Sasquatch," I said, using the word I'd never dared speak aloud before. "That's what it was, wasn't it? A young Bigfoot," Martha shrugged. "Does it need a name? It existed. You saw it. Your children played with it. Maybe that's enough." 3 days later, I died. At least that's when my story should end. But stories don't really end that way, do they? They continue in the memories of those who hear them, in the questions they raise, in the possibilities they suggest. I never saw the forest child again after that spring of 1964. The forest behind Lesk Market holds its secrets tightly. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees at night, I imagine other mothers in other remote cabins and stores along the Alaskan wilderness, hearing the laughter of their children playing with someone or something they don't quite understand. And maybe, just maybe, they'll have the courage to look, to see, to remember, and 40 years from now, as their own lives draw to a close, to finally tell someone what they witnessed on those quiet midnight visits from the edge of the unexplained world. Story 10. I remember the fog being thick as soup that September night in 2012. The kind of fog that swallows your headlights and makes the world disappear 20 feet ahead of your car. My daughter Violet sat behind me in Joey's old Chevy while Joey drove and his girlfriend Mandy rode behind him. We were heading from Cloak to Heidelberg on Prince of Wales Island, a drive we'd made countless times before. "Mum, you think we should have waited until morning?" Violet asked, her voice tense. She'd never liked driving in fog. "We'll be fine," I replied, though I was gripping the door handle tighter than I needed to. "Joey knows this road like the back of his hand." Joey, my nephew, nodded confidently, but kept his speed down to about 35. The Cloak Lake Highway wound through dense forest, and in these conditions you couldn't risk going faster. The clock on the dashboard read 8:07 p.m. Still plenty of time to make it to Heidelberg before it got too late. The radio played some country song I didn't recognize, and Joey hummed along, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. The headlights carved a shallow tunnel through the fog, showing just enough of the road ahead to keep us on the pavement. The trees on either side were just dark smudges against the white mist. "There's supposed to be a break in the weather tomorrow," Mandy said from the back seat, scrolling through her phone. The blue light illuminated her face. "Maybe we could—" "What the hell is that?" Joey interrupted, slowing the car down even more. Something was moving across the road ahead of us. Something big. At first I thought it might be a bear. We get plenty of those around here, but as the headlights caught it more fully, I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was no bear. It was walking upright, completely upright, and it was tall. Not just tall like a big man, but impossibly tall. "Joey, slow down," I whispered, as if it might hear me through the closed windows and engine noise. "I am," he replied, his voice tight. The figure stepped across the highway in 4 long, relaxed strides. It didn't hurry, didn't scramble. It moved with purpose, but without panic. What struck me immediately was its color, a light gray or cream standing out against the darkness. As we got closer, I could see it was covered in hair, not fur exactly, but hair about 3 or 4 inches long. Then it did something I'll never forget as long as I live. Instead of continuing into the woods on the other side of the road, it turned and sat down on a small rise in the roadside ditch, just as casual as you please, like someone waiting for a bus. Joey had slowed to a crawl now, maybe 15 miles per hour, and we were approaching where it sat. My side of the car, the passenger side, was going to pass right by it. "Linda, what is that?" Mandy's voice came from the back, higher pitched than normal. I couldn't answer. My eyes were locked on the figure sitting by the roadside. As we drew alongside, I got a clear view of it, not more than 12 feet away from me. The headlights illuminated it perfectly. It was massive, 8, maybe 9 feet tall, even sitting down. Its body was lean but muscular, like a baseball player rather than a bulky football player, covered all over with that grayish hair. If I had to guess, it weighed at least 330 pounds. Its face, God, its face. It looked old, tired somehow. There was intelligence in those eyes, deep set under a prominent brow ridge. As our headlights hit it full on, it slouched forward, bending its head down away from the glare, One hand, a massive hand with long fingers, came up to shield its face. That hand, I'll never forget that hand. It wasn't a paw or a claw. It was a hand, just scaled up, with opposable thumbs and everything. We drove past it, and I twisted in my seat to keep watching through the rear window until the fog swallowed it up. "Stop the car," Joey said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I want to go back." "No!" Violet and Mandy shouted simultaneously. I was torn. Part of me wanted to see it again, to confirm what we'd all witnessed, but a deeper instinct told me to keep going, to put distance between us and whatever that thing was. "Keep driving, Joey," I said firmly. "Just keep driving." He hesitated, then nodded, pressing down on the gas pedal. For the next mile, nobody spoke. The only sound was our breathing and the hum of the engine. Finally, Mandy broke the silence. "That wasn't a person in a suit," she said flatly. "No way." "Too big," I agreed. "And the way it moved—" "Sasquatch," Joey said, the word hanging in the air. "We just saw a goddamn Sasquatch." "Bigfoot isn't real," Violet said automatically, but her voice wavered. "It can't be real." "Then what did we just see?" I asked, turning to look at my daughter in the back seat. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "I don't know," she whispered. We made it to Heidelberg 20 minutes later, pulling into my sister Jean's driveway. The lights were on in the house, warm yellow rectangles cutting through the fog. As we stepped out of the car, the cold, damp air hit my face. It felt good, grounding. For a moment I wondered if what we'd seen had been some kind of mass hallucination, a trick of the fog and the headlights. But one look at Joey's face as he shut off the engine told me it had been real. We'd all seen it. Jean opened the front door before we even knocked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I was starting to worry, with this fog and all. She stopped mid-sentence, looking at our faces. "What's wrong? Did something happen on the road?" We filed into her kitchen, and Joey immediately went to the fridge, pulling out 4 beers. He didn't ask if anyone wanted one. He just popped the tops and set them on the table. "You're not going to believe this," I started, wrapping my cold fingers around the bottle. "Try me," Jean said, sitting down across from me. I told her everything. The fog, the figure crossing the road, how it sat down, what it looked like up close. The others jumped in with details I missed. When we finished, Jean sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "You think I'm crazy?" I said flatly. She shook her head slowly. No, I don't." She got up and walked to a drawer by the sink, pulling out a local newspaper from a few weeks back. She laid it on the table, pointing to a small article near the bottom of the page. The headline read, "Hunter reports large upright figure near Klawak Lake." Mitch Svensson saw something 2 weeks ago, said it was watching him from the trees while he was field dressing a deer. He fired a warning shot and it disappeared. Joey grabbed the paper, reading quickly. "Same description. Grey-colored, tall, moved on 2 legs. And there've been others," Jean continued. "Pete Hayes found footprints last spring, bigger than anything he'd ever seen. And the Lincoln kids said they heard strange calls near their camp last summer, not like any animal they recognized." I took a long swallow of beer, feeling it cold all the way down to my stomach. "So, what do we do with this?" I finally asked. "What can we do?" Jean replied. "Report it to who? The sheriff? Fish and Wildlife?" "They'd think we were nuts," Joey said, shaking his head. "Or worse, they'd believe us and turn this place into a circus," Mandy added. "News crews, monster hunters, tourists with cameras." She was right. Prince of Wales Island was our home, a place where everybody knew everybody, where we could go weeks without seeing outsiders. The thought of it becoming some kind of Bigfoot tourist trap made my skin crawl. "I'm going back tomorrow," Joey announced suddenly, "with my camera." "Like hell you are," I snapped. "We don't know what that thing is or what it might do." "It didn't seem aggressive," he argued. "It was just sitting there, Linda. If it wanted to hurt us, it could have." "That doesn't mean you should go looking for it," Violet said. "Leave it alone." We argued for another hour, eventually agreeing that we wouldn't tell anyone else what we'd seen, at least not for now. The fog was even thicker the next morning, and despite Joey's determination the night before, he didn't go back to look for the creature. I think in the light of day, with the memory fresh but the adrenaline gone, caution won out over curiosity. 2 days later, I went back to Klawock. The fog had cleared, and the drive was completely different in the sunshine. I slowed down when I reached the stretch of road where we'd seen it. There was the ditch, the small rise where it had sat. I pulled over and got out of my car. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional bird call. I walked to the spot where it had crossed the road. The ground was hard-packed dirt on the shoulder, transitioning to moss and pine needles as it sloped toward the trees. I searched for footprints, but found nothing definitive, just some disturbed ground that could have been caused by anything. At the exact spot where it had sat, I crouched down, placing my hand on the ground. Nothing special about this spot. Nothing to indicate that something extraordinary had happened here, yet I knew it had. I stood up and looked into the forest, dense with spruce and hemlock trees. Was it watching me now? Had it gone far away, or did it live nearby? I realized I wasn't afraid. Curious, yes, and still in awe of what we'd seen, but not afraid. "We won't bother you," I said aloud, feeling a little foolish talking to the empty woods. "This is your home too." I got back in my car and drove away. Over the following weeks, I read everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings in Alaska. There were more than I'd expected, going back decades. Most described creatures darker in color, brown or black, but a few mentioned the grayish coloring we'd seen. Some theorized that they might gray with age, like human hair. Joey, true to form, couldn't keep quiet for long. He told his buddy Mike, who told his girlfriend, who told her sister. Within a month, most people in Klawock and Heidelberg had heard some version of our story. Some believed us, some didn't. A few people shared their own stories of strange sightings or sounds in the woods that they'd never told anyone before. The outside world never got wind of it, thankfully. No news crews or paranormal investigators showed up. Our encounter remained a local story, passed around at the diner or the bar, another thread in the fabric of island lore. 6 months later, in March 2013, a logging crew reported finding unusual footprints in a fresh snowfall about 5 miles from where we'd had our encounter. They took photos, clear impressions, 18 inches long with 5 distinct toes. The stride length measured nearly 5 feet. The photos circulated around town for a while, then faded into the background like our story had. I've driven that stretch of road hundreds of times since that foggy September night. Sometimes I slow down at that spot, scanning the tree line, half hoping and half dreading to see that figure again. I never have, but sometimes, especially in the fog, I feel like something is watching from just beyond the reach of my headlights. Not menacing, just aware, present. And I remember how that massive creature had simply sat there as we passed, old and tired-looking, raising a hand to shield its eyes from our lights. I don't know what we saw that night. I can't explain it in any way that fits neatly into what I was taught about the world and what lives in it. But I know what I saw, what we all saw, that cream-colored hair, those deep-set eyes, that massive frame perched by the roadside like it belonged there. Which I suppose it did. Long before there was a road, long before there were headlights and cars and humans building towns, there was the wilderness of Prince of Wales Island, and perhaps, living in the deep forests and misty mountains, there were always creatures like the one we saw, watching, avoiding, surviving. I've never told this story to anyone outside our island. I probably never will. Some things belong to the place where they happen, and this is one of them. But I know what I saw that night in September 2012. And so do Joey, Violet, and Mandy. 4 witnesses to something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that crossed the Clawok Lake Highway in 4 long strides and sat by the roadside in the fog, as real as the ground under my feet. Story 11. The sea was angry that day. Cold Pacific water sloshed over the gunwale of my trawler as I worked the lines. My boat, the Mary Louise, had weathered many storms, but this one hit without warning. A sudden tempest that boiled up from the southeast, catching me alone near the rugged shoreline of Prince of Wales Island. I'm Ellie Harmon, or at least that's what folks around Ketchikan called me before I abandoned Alaska altogether. Been fishing these waters for 15 years, since my dad passed and left me his boat and gear. Never once thought I'd lose her to the sea. The first crack came when a massive wave slammed the Mary Louise sideways. I heard the hull splinter before I felt the deck tilt. Water rushed in fast, too fast for the bilge pumps. I grabbed my emergency radio, but the damn thing was dead. No time to think. I snatched my knife and the survival whistle from around my neck. The Mary Louise went down in less than 2 minutes. The shock of the water stole my breath. October in southeast Alaska means hypothermia is minutes away, not hours. I kicked hard toward shore, maybe half a mile distant. My heavy boots dragged like anchors, but I didn't dare remove them. I'd need them if I reached land. When, I corrected myself between gasps. When I reached land. Each stroke burned my muscles. The current fought me, trying to pull me toward open water. My wool sweater, jeans and raincoat became waterlogged weights. I've never been more afraid than in those 20 minutes, swimming through the chop, watching the distant tree line grow agonizingly, slowly larger. I hit the rocky beach on my hands and knees, retching seawater. My fingers were white and numb. My whole body shook violently. Somehow I dragged myself above the tide line and collapsed on the wet stones. I don't know how long I lay there. The rain had stopped, but the wind still howled through the Sitka spruce and hemlock forest that crowded the narrow beach. No boats on the horizon, no planes overhead, just me, the sound of waves, and the dark wall of trees. First priority was shelter. Hypothermia would kill me within hours if I didn't get dry and find some warmth. I stumbled into the forest edge, my movements clumsy with cold. The thick canopy had kept some of the ground relatively dry. I gathered armfuls of fallen cedar boughs, dragging them to a spot between 2 massive fallen logs. With frozen fingers, I wove the branches into a crude lean-to against one log, creating a small space where I could huddle out of the wind. More branches became a platform to keep me off the damp ground. I'd been raised in these parts, knew the basics of survival, but knowing and doing are different beasts entirely. Fire was my next need, but everything was wet. I dug through forest debris until I found the driest material I could, the underside of shelf fungi from a rotting stump, some shredded inner bark, and small twigs from beneath a dense spruce. I cleared a spot between my shelter logs and arranged my pitiful materials. My hands shook so badly I dropped my knife twice while trying to strike it against a piece of quartz I'd found. Sparks flew, but nothing caught. I tried again and again, growing desperate as daylight faded. The temperature was already dropping. On what must have been my 30th attempt, a tiny ember finally caught in the fungus. I hunched over it, blowing gently, adding the smallest twigs, then larger ones as the flame grew. When it was finally crackling, I wept with relief. I stripped off my soaked outer clothes and hung them near the fire, huddling close to the flames in my damp undergarments. As night fell fully, I heard the forest come alive with sounds. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, branches creaking in the wind. That first night was the longest of my life. I fed the fire constantly, dozing in short, fitful bursts. Each time I woke, I added more wood, praying the flame wouldn't die. The cold seeped into my bones despite the fire. I knew nobody would be looking for me yet. My check-in wasn't due for another 2 days. Dawn broke grey and misty. My clothes were mostly dry, stiff with salt but wearable. My stomach growled fiercely. I hadn't eaten since breakfast the previous day. I needed food and better shelter if I was going to survive until rescue. I spent that first morning improving my lean-to, weaving more branches for better wind protection and gathering moss to stuff into gaps. I found a creek about 50 yards inland and drank deeply, the cold water soothing my parched throat. Food was harder. I knew these shores had plenty to offer, but October meant slim pickings. At the beach, I pried limpets from rocks with my knife and found a few small crabs in tide pools. I ate them raw, grimacing at the briny slime, but grateful for the protein. Back at my shelter, I built up the fire again and sat watching the flames, trying not to think about the Mary Louise on the bottom of the channel or how long it might take before anyone realized I was missing. The second night was marginally better. My improved shelter kept more heat in, and exhaustion pulled me into deeper sleep between fire tendings. Still, I woke stiff and hungry, my lips cracked from dehydration and salt. I crawled out of my shelter as the first grey light filtered through the trees. And that's when I saw it. About 6 feet from the entrance to my lean-to sat a neat pile of food. I froze, staring. There were dark red huckleberries arranged in a small mound. Beside them lay several mushrooms. I recognized chanterelles and hedgehogs. There were fern rhizomes cleaned of dirt, their white flesh exposed. A cluster of limpets already removed from their shells. Even a handful of beach asparagus. I approached slowly, looking around the clearing. Nothing moved except the branches swaying in the morning breeze. "Hello?" I called, my voice rough. "Is someone there?" Only the distant cry of a raven answered. I examined the pile closely. This was no random collection. These items had been gathered deliberately, cleaned and arranged with care. The limpets weren't the ones I'd collected yesterday. These were bigger, fresher. My first thought was that another person must be nearby, a hunter or hiker who'd spotted my fire. But something felt off about that explanation. Why not show themselves? Why leave food secretly in the night? I scanned the ground around the offering. The forest floor was damp needle duff and moss. It should have shown footprints, but I could see none except my own from yesterday. The hair on my arms stood up despite the morning chill. Hunger overrode my unease. I gathered the food and brought it back to my fire, which I stoked back to life. I cooked the mushrooms and fern roots on a flat stone by the flames. The berries and limpets I ate raw. It wasn't much, but it eased the gnawing in my stomach and gave me strength. All that morning, I explored the area around my camp, looking for signs of another human. I found none. No footprints, no broken branches, no scraps of cloth or trash. This stretch of shoreline was miles from any settlement or cabin. The only sound was the wind, waves, and occasional bird call. I stopped at a high point, overlooking the water, and scanned the horizon, hoping to see a boat. Nothing. I used my knife to cut branches for a signal fire on the beach, arranging them so they'd create thick smoke when lit. Then I gathered more food, whatever I could find along the shore, more limpets, some seaweed, a few mussels from a rocky outcropping. As dusk approached, I returned to my shelter, fed my fire, and cooked my meager findings. The night grew cold quickly. I huddled in my lean-to, listening to the sounds of the forest grow louder as darkness fell. Something felt different that night. I couldn't pinpoint what, but a sensation of being watched crept over me. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Still, I kept the fire burning brighter than necessary, the flames casting jumping shadows on the surrounding trees. Several times I thought I heard movement in the underbrush beyond the firelight, a crack of a branch, the soft pad of something heavy. Each time I called out, heard nothing in response, and eventually convinced myself it was just deer or maybe a bear. Despite my unease, exhaustion claimed me. I woke once in deepest night. The fire burned down to coals. As I reached for more wood, I froze, A sound came from the darkness beyond my camp, a low, rumbling exhalation, not quite a growl, but deeper than any human breath. I strained my eyes, but could see nothing in the pitch black. I threw wood on the fire, hands shaking, and the flames leapt up. Whatever had made the sound was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Morning of the third day dawned foggy and still. I crawled from my shelter, stiff and sore. And there it was again. Another pile of food, larger this time, more berries, different mushrooms, what looked like camas bulbs, even a cluster of small fish, herring, I thought, arranged in a neat row. Beside it sat a section of fresh cedar bark, stripped and flattened as if to serve as a plate. My breath caught. This was no coincidence or accident. Something or someone was deliberately bringing me food, watching me, staying hidden. I looked around wildly, scanning the tree line. "Who's there?" I shouted. "Please show yourself, I need help." My voice echoed back from the forest, unanswered. I approached the food cautiously. Again, no footprints marked the damp earth around it. But this time, I noticed something else, a faint, musky odor hanging in the air, unlike anything I could name. Not human sweat, not bear, not deer, something else entirely. I gathered the food and returned to my fire. As I ate the fish, I kept looking over my shoulder, peering into the shadows between trees. The fog made visibility poor, creating moving shapes in the mist that disappeared when I focused on them. With a fuller stomach, I decided to walk the beach again, hoping to spot a passing boat. The tide was out, exposing a wide stretch of rocky shore. I followed it for maybe half a mile before stopping to rest on a boulder. That's when I saw the tracks. They crossed a patch of wet sand near the waterline, coming from the forest and leading back in. I walked closer, then stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. These were not human footprints. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot prints, with 5 distinct toe impressions. They sank deep into the sand, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I followed them with my eyes to where they disappeared into the dense underbrush. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in southeast Alaska has. Tales of the Kushtaka from Tlingit elders, or what outsiders called Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I'd always dismissed them as myths, legends born from isolation and the primeval nature of these forests. Standing there alone, staring at those immense tracks, I wasn't so certain anymore. I hurried back to my camp, constantly looking over my shoulder. The rest of that day, I busied myself maintaining my fire, improving my shelter, anything to keep my mind occupied. I tried not to think about what might be watching me from the trees. As afternoon faded toward evening, I heard it, the distinctive thrum of an engine. I raced to the beach and saw a Coast Guard cutter moving along the channel. I lit my signal fire and began waving my arms, screaming until my voice gave out. They spotted the smoke. The cutter turned toward shore, and soon a smaller boat was launching from its side. I collapsed onto the rocks, overcome with relief. The Coast Guard crew found me sobbing on the beach. They wrapped me in emergency blankets, gave me water and energy bars, asked me questions I barely processed. I remember telling them about the Mary Louise going down, about building the shelter, about surviving 3 nights alone. As they helped me into their boat, I turned back toward the forest edge. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement, something large and dark, stepping back into the shadows between 2 massive spruces. Then it was gone, if it had ever been there at all. On the cutter, after medical checks and hot food, I finally asked the question that had been burning in my mind. Did you send someone ahead to find me, before the boat arrived? The Coast Guard officer looked confused. No, ma'am, you weren't even officially missing yet. We spotted your smoke by chance during a routine patrol. So there's no settlements nearby? No cabins or camps where someone might have been staying? Not for at least 15 miles in either direction. That's pretty isolated coastline. I told him about the food I'd found each morning. He suggested it might have been left by another boater who'd come ashore, but left before making contact. His explanation sounded hollow, even to him. That was 3 months ago. I'm in Port Angeles now, staying with my sister while I figure out what's next. I sold my fishing permit, can't stomach the thought of going back on the water yet. Maybe never. I've told this story exactly twice, once to my sister, who believes me, and once to a Forest Service biologist, who politely suggested stress and hunger might have affected my perceptions. Maybe they're right. Maybe hunger and fear caused me to imagine things, to misinterpret ordinary occurrences as something mysterious. The food could have been scattered by animals, the tracks made by bears, the sounds just normal forest noises magnified by my isolation. But some nights I wake up suddenly, thinking I hear that deep rumbling breath outside my window, and I remember the care with which those foods were arranged, the deliberate placement, the clear intent to help. Whatever was watching me in those woods recognized my distress. It knew what foods I could eat, brought them cleaned and ready. It chose to help me survive, but never to reveal itself. I don't know if I'll ever go back to Alaska, but sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees outside my sister's house, I find myself whispering a thank you to whatever watched over me on that lonely shore. Story 12. The sun came up late that August morning in 41. I'd been on the water since first light, which wasn't saying much for Alaska in the summer. My small fishing boat, the Marla Sioux, bobbed gently against the rising tide as I anchored on the backside of Ruth Island in Thomas Bay. The water lapped at the hull, a peaceful sound that belied what I was about to witness. I was Frank Miller, just a simple boat skipper from Juneau who'd spent 20 years navigating the waters of southeastern Alaska. Nothing special about me. I had calloused hands, a weather-beaten face, and enough experience to know the water's blind. That morning, I was looking for deer. Our supplies had run low, and fresh venison would keep me going for another week before heading back to port. I cut the engine and let the boat drift slowly toward shore, grabbing my Winchester rifle from the small cabin. The morning air bit at my face with its cool dampness. A heavy mist hung over the tree line, typical for Thomas Bay this time of year. As the Marla Sioux's bow scraped gently against the rocky shore, I secured the boat to a sturdy pine with a quick hitch knot. The small beach stretched about 30 yards, bordered by dense forest that climbed up the hillside. Fir trees and pines created a wall of green and brown, with patches of brush filling the spaces between trunks. Perfect deer country. I loaded my rifle and climbed carefully over the gunwale, my rubber boots splashing in the shallow water. That's when I spotted it. A young buck at the edge of the tree line, maybe 100 yards down the beach. It stood motionless, head raised, nostrils flaring as it tested the wind. 4 points on its antlers. Not the biggest I'd seen, but more than enough meat for my needs. I raised the Winchester slowly, feeling the cold steel against my cheek as I sighted down the barrel. My finger tensed on the trigger. The buck hadn't noticed me yet. One clean shot would do it. Then the ground shook, not an exaggeration. The actual ground vibrated beneath my feet. At first, I thought it might be a small earthquake, not uncommon in these parts. But then came the sound, a crashing through undergrowth, branches snapping, something big moving fast. The deer's head jerked toward the forest, its body tensing. I kept my rifle up, but my attention shifted to where the deer was looking. The thing burst from the trees so quickly, I barely registered what happened. One moment there was just forest edge, the next this creature stood there. It had covered 20 yards in a single bound. It was enormous. 8 feet tall at least, standing upright on 2 legs. Not a bear. Bears don't move like that. This thing was shaped like a man, but bigger, much bigger. Black hair covered its entire body, not fur exactly, but hair, matted in places, hanging long around its massive shoulders and down its back. My hands began to shake. The rifle suddenly felt like a child's toy in my grip. The buck froze, caught between my presence and this new threat. That hesitation cost it everything. The creature moved with shocking speed. 3 massive strides covered the distance between it and the deer. The buck finally broke from its trance and tried to bolt, but it was too late. One huge, hairy arm shot out and grabbed the deer by the neck. What happened next burned itself into my memory. With a single fluid motion, the creature twisted the deer's head. The crack echoed across the water like a rifle shot. The buck's body went completely limp, neck broken instantly. I stood paralyzed, rifle half raised, unable to move or even breathe. The creature turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its face. Not quite human, not quite animal. Deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow ridge. A broad, flat nose. No expression I could read. Did it see me? I don't know. If it did, it didn't care. I presented no threat or interest compared to its fresh kill. With casual strength that defied belief, it swung the dead deer under one arm, holding the 150-pound animal like I might carry a small duffel bag. Then, without a sound, it turned and leaped back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I don't remember dropping my rifle. I don't remember scrambling back to my boat. The next clear memory I have is the roar of the engine as I pushed the throttle to maximum, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. I didn't look back at Ruth Island as Thomas Bay fell away behind me. "Frank, you still with us?" Jim's voice pulled me back to the present. I blinked and looked around at the familiar surroundings of Pete's bar in Juneau. My beer had gone warm, forgotten during my retelling. Jim Caldwell and Pete Sorensen sat across from me, both looking uncomfortable. Pete scratched his grey-streaked beard, eyes darting between Jim and me. "Sorry," I mumbled, taking a long drink despite the beer's tepid temperature. "Gets me every time." Jim cleared his throat. "Look, Frank, I didn't mean to bring up bad memories. I just thought since the salmon are running in Thomas Bay—" "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "I told you, I won't go back there. Not for all the salmon in Alaska." It had been nearly a year since that day at Ruth Island. A year of nightmares, of waking up drenched in sweat, hearing that deer's necks snap over and over. A year of people looking at me sideways when I refused certain jobs, when I plotted courses that added hours to avoid Thomas Bay. "Frank," Pete leaned forward, lowering his voice, "you know what folks are saying, don't you?" I stared at the scratched wooden table. "That I'm crazy, or a drunk, or both." "Nobody's saying crazy," Jim said, but his tone lacked conviction. "The hell they aren't." I pushed my glass away. "Look, I know what I saw. That wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was something else." "A Sasquatch," Pete said, testing the word like it might burn his tongue. "That's what the Indians call them. Kushtaka, some say." "I don't care what name you put on it," I replied. "It killed a full-grown buck with its bare hands, snapped its neck like a twig, and it was fast, faster than anything that size has a right to be." Jim shifted uncomfortably. "Even if it was real, Frank, that was a year ago. Lightning doesn't strike twice." "You willing to bet your life on that?" I asked. He didn't answer. "I've been on Alaskan waters since before you were shaving, Jim. I've seen brown bears that could tear a man apart. I've weathered storms that sent better men than me to the bottom, but I've never been afraid of the wilderness until that day." The bar had grown quieter around us, other patrons pretending not to listen while straining to catch every word. "The salmon run," Jim started again. "Find another skipper," I cut him off, "or another bay. Nobody knows those waters like you do, and nobody's going to get me back there, not for any price." The silence stretched between us. Finally, Jim nodded, defeated. "All right, Frank, we'll try Stevens Passage instead." "Good choice," I said, relaxing slightly. "Fish aren't as big, but they're plentiful this year." Pete refilled our glasses from the pitcher. "You ever report what you saw to the authorities or something?" I let out a harsh laugh. And tell them what? That I saw some monster the natives have been talking about for centuries? That I was too scared to even take a shot at it? That would have gone over well. Someone should know, Pete insisted. What if it's dangerous to people, I mean? It is dangerous, I said flatly, but that thing wasn't interested in me. It wanted food and it got it. The forest is its territory, not ours. We're just visitors. Still, Jim said, if there really is something out there. There is, I said, and the best thing anyone can do is stay clear of Thomas Bay, especially the backside of Ruth Island. Jim and Pete exchanged glances. I knew that look. They believed I'd seen something, but not what I claimed. Maybe a bear walking briefly on hind legs, maybe a moose in poor light. Their doubt was written across their faces. You had to be there, I said quietly. Had to see how it moved, how it killed. No animal I know kills like that. Except humans, Pete pointed out. This wasn't human, I said. Not even close. The conversation shifted to safer topics after that. Fishing prospects, weather forecasts, the war news from Europe. But I couldn't focus. My mind kept returning to that beach, to those few terrible seconds when the world I thought I knew changed forever. 2 days later, I was loading supplies onto the Marla Sioux for the trip to Stevens Passage when Jim appeared on the dock. He carried his own gear, fishing tackle, a small cooler, and a canvas bag I assumed contained clothes and necessities. You ready? He asked, as if our conversation at Pete's had never happened. Just about, I replied, securing a crate of preserved food. Pete coming? Changed his mind, said his back's been acting up. I nodded. Pete's bad back appeared whenever real work loomed on the horizon. His loss. Weather looks good for the next 3 days. Jim tossed his gear aboard and helped me with the remaining supplies. We worked in comfortable silence for a while. Jim was a good companion that way, didn't feel the need to fill every moment with talk. Finally, as we cast off and I guided the Marla Sioux out of the harbor, he spoke up. Frank, about Thomas Bay. My hands tightened on the wheel. I thought we settled that. We did, he said quickly. Stevens Passage it is, but I've been thinking about what you saw. I kept my eyes on the water ahead. And? My grandfather used to tell stories. He worked lumber camps all over the territory back in the early days. Swore he saw something once up near Ketchikan. Big, hairy, walking on 2 legs. This got my attention. He'd tell anyone besides you? Jim shook his head. Just family. Said the other loggers would have laughed him out of camp. He paused. The thing is, Grandpa wasn't a man for tall tales. If he said he saw something, he saw it. The Marla Sioux's engine thrummed steadily as we cleared the harbor and entered open water. To our right rose the mountains, dense with forest. To our left stretched the vast expanse of the inside passage. Did he ever go back? I asked. To where he saw it? No, Jim said quietly. Quit that camp the next day. Told them he had family troubles back home. I nodded. That sounded familiar. You really think these things are out there? Jim asked. Living in the forests all around us? I know what I saw, I replied. One, at least. Maybe there are more, maybe not. But that one was real as you or me. Jim fell silent again, staring out at the water. After a while, he said, My brother Dave is working a fishing boat out of Sitka these days. Says a couple of the Indian crews won't fish certain inlets. Say they're bad places, haunted. Not haunted, I corrected. Inhabited. The next several hours passed in routine work. We navigated the familiar channels, Jim checking maps occasionally, though I hardly needed them. The Alaskan coast had been my second home for decades. Every inlet, every hidden shoal was mapped in my memory. As evening approached, we anchored in a small cove to rest for the night. After a simple dinner of beans and canned ham, we sat on deck with cups of coffee laced with whiskey. The summer sky stayed light well into what should have been night, the strange half-darkness of Alaskan summers, casting everything in muted tones. "You ever hear of others?" Jim asked suddenly. "Other skippers who've seen things?" I took a sip of my spiked coffee before answering. "Stories. Always stories. Mostly from natives. Most white men who see something strange either keep quiet or blame it on bad light, bad liquor, or both. But not you." "I know what I saw," I repeated. It had become my mantra. No light tricks, no alcohol. That thing was flesh and blood. Jim nodded slowly. "Dave says there's a whole stretch of coast that Tlingit won't go near. Been that way for generations." "Smart people, the Tlingit," I said. "They respect what they don't understand." "Unlike us," Jim said with a hint of a smile. "Unlike us," I agreed. We turned in shortly after, the gentle rocking of the boat normally lulling me to sleep quickly. But that night, my mind wandered back to Ruth Island, to Thomas Bay. What was it doing now, that creature? Hunting? Sleeping? Did it have a family? Others of its kind? I dozed fitfully, dreaming of dark forests and creatures watching from the shadows. The fishing at Stevens Passage proved decent, if not spectacular. We filled most of our containers by the end of the second day. Jim seemed disappointed, though whether at the catch or the lack of mysterious sightings, I couldn't tell. On the third day, as we headed back toward Juneau, a summer storm blew in from the Gulf. Nothing the Marla Sioux couldn't handle, but enough to make for uncomfortable going. Rain lashed the windows of the small wheelhouse, and waves battered against the hull. "We could take shelter," Jim suggested, holding onto a support beam as the boat pitched. "Wait it out." I checked our position, doing quick calculations. Nearest safe harbor is an hour in this weather. We can make Juneau in 3 if we push through. Your call. Jim looked at the angry sky, then at me. "What's the safe harbor?" "Small cove just outside Thomas Bay." His expression changed instantly. "Juneau it is." I nodded, hiding my relief. "Juneau it is." We battled the storm for the next 3 hours, waves growing higher as the wind intensified. The Marla Sioux creaked and groaned, but held steady. She was a good boat, built for these waters. As we finally approached Juneau Harbor, the storm began to subside, as if it had spent its fury pushing us home. The rain eased to a drizzle, and the clouds broke enough to let watery sunshine through. "That was a bit too exciting," Jim said as we tied up at the dock. I laughed. The sound strange after the tension of the journey. Welcome to the skipper's life. Hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. "Speaking of terror," Jim said, helping unload our catch, "you ever think about going back? To Thomas Bay, I mean." I paused, a crate of salmon in my hands. "No. Not even to see if it's still there." "Especially not to see if it's still there," I replied. "Some things are better left alone, Jim. That creature has its territory. I have mine. No good comes from crossing those lines." Jim nodded slowly. "I suppose you're right." We finished unloading in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As Jim gathered his personal gear to head home, he turned to me one last time. "Frank," he said hesitantly, "thanks for telling me about what you saw. Can't be easy carrying that alone." I leaned against the Marla Sioux's rail, suddenly tired beyond words. "No," I said, "it isn't easy, but it's my burden. Doesn't have to be. Not anymore." I smiled faintly. "You believe me then? Really believe me?" Jim held my gaze for a long moment. "I believe you saw something that scared the hell out of you. And I've known you long enough to know you don't scare easy." It wasn't a complete endorsement, but it was more than I'd gotten from anyone else. I nodded my thanks. "Just promise me one thing," I said as he turned to go. "What's that?" "Stay away from Thomas Bay, especially Ruth Island." Jim smiled. "Don't worry, after that storm, I've had enough excitement for a while. I watched him walk away down the dock, his figure growing smaller against the backdrop of Juneau's waterfront. The encounter with the creature had changed me, marked me in ways I was still discovering. But for the first time since that day, I felt a small weight lift from my shoulders. Someone else knew, someone else at least partially believed. It wasn't much, but it was something. I turned back to the Marla Sioux, running my hand along her weather-beaten hull. She'd served me well, taken me to countless fishing grounds across Alaska's vast wilderness. But there was one place she would never take me again. One shoreline I would never revisit. Some memories are best left undisturbed. Some creatures are best left to their hunting grounds. And Thomas Bay belonged to one such creature now, had perhaps always belonged to it and its kind. I cast one last glance at the distant mountains before heading home, wondering what other secrets lay hidden in Alaska's endless wilderness and hoping I would never discover them firsthand. Story 13. I never believed in monsters until one showed up in my backyard. Now I can't stop seeing them. It started in May 2014. The evening air was cool but comfortable as I stood at my kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes and looking out over our property. Living on 20 acres in Maplewood had been my sanctuary after the divorce, a place where Rex, my golden retriever, and I could heal without nosy neighbors or pitying friends dropping by unannounced. Rex had been sleeping under the kitchen table, but suddenly shot up, his ears perked. He rushed to the back door and started barking, not his usual squirrel alert or delivery driver bark. This was frantic, almost panicked. His claws scraped against the door as he tried to dig his way through. "What is it, boy?" I asked, drying my hands on a dish towel. Rex just barked louder, his whole body rigid. I peered out the window toward our backyard field. The grass was high, about 4 feet tall, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance. Then I saw them. 6 or 7 deer, bursting from the tree line on the far side of the field, running at full speed. I'd seen deer on our property hundreds of times, but never moving like this. They weren't casually bounding along. They were running in blind panic, crashing through the tall grass with no regard for direction, except away. Something was chasing them. I squinted, trying to make out what had spooked them. A coyote. We'd had problems with them before. Maybe a black bear. They occasionally wandered through the area. That's when I saw it. Behind the deer, moving through the field, was something tall enough that its upper body cleared the 4-foot grass. It was running on 2 legs, not 4. Its movement was wrong. Not like a bear rearing up. Not like anything I'd ever seen. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair, and it moved with purpose, shoulders swinging, arms pumping, like a person running. But no person was that big or moved that way. I dropped the dish towel and backed away from the window. Rex was now howling, scratching frantically at the door. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No way." But I knew what I'd seen. The shape, the movement, the size. It had been a Sasquatch, a goddamn Bigfoot in my backyard in Connecticut. I didn't sleep that night. I kept all the lights on and checked the locks twice. Rex refused to leave my side, growling at the slightest sound from outside. I told myself I'd been mistaken. The fading light, the distance, the tall grass, they'd all played tricks on my eyes, but I knew better. The next morning, I walked the property's edge, looking for tracks or signs. I found nothing conclusive, just trampled grass where the deer had run and some broken branches. No massive footprints, no tufts of mysterious hair. Nothing I could take a picture of and show someone without looking crazy. For weeks, I kept what I'd seen to myself. Who would believe me? Sasquatch sightings were for remote mountains in the Pacific Northwest, not Connecticut suburbs. I'd be laughed out of town. In June, about a month later, my friend Charlie came over. We'd known each other since high school, and he was one of the few people who didn't treat me like damaged goods after the divorce. We sat around a small fire in my backyard, drinking beers and catching up. It was around 9 o'clock when we heard it, coyotes yipping and howling in the northeast corner of the property. Their sounds echoed through the darkness, familiar and almost comforting in their normalcy. "Sounds like they've got something cornered," Charlie said, taking a swig of his beer. I nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "They've been active lately. I've been keeping Rex inside at—" A sound cut through the night from the opposite corner of the property. Not a howl or a bark, a screech. No, not even a screech. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, deep and primal, part roar and part scream. Charlie dropped his beer. "What the fuck was that?" The coyotes went silent, not gradually quiet, immediately completely silent. 1 second they were in full chorus, the next, nothing. "Lynn!" Charlie's voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "What was that?" I stared into the darkness beyond our little circle of firelight. I don't know. But I did know. Or at least I suspected. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the night. Charlie left earlier than planned, and I noticed he checked his car's back seat before getting in. I didn't blame him. A few weeks later, in early July, Charlie came back over. I hadn't told him about what I'd seen in May. I wasn't ready to sound crazy, not even to my oldest friend. Instead, I suggested we hit golf balls into the field, a normal, everyday activity to convince myself that life was still normal. The grass was higher now, almost 5 feet tall in places. The summer had been wet, and everything was growing like crazy. We took turns driving balls from my back patio into the field. "I'm going to find every one of those balls come fall," I said, watching my shot disappear into the grass. "Once everything dies back." Charlie was lining up his shot when he paused, club hovering in mid-swing. "Lynn," he said quietly, "look at the lower part of the field." I followed his gaze. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just tall grass moving in the light breeze. Then I noticed an area where the grass was moving differently, not swaying with the wind, but being pushed aside. Something was moving through it. "Probably a deer," I said, but my mouth had gone dry. We stood frozen, watching. The movement continued for about 2 minutes, creating a visible path through the grass. Whatever it wasn't small. Then it stood up. It rose slowly, unfolding until it towered above the 5-foot grass. Even from this distance, I could see broad shoulders, long arms, a head that sat directly on those shoulders with no visible neck. "Jesus Christ," Charlie whispered, "that's not a deer." The creature stood completely still for a moment, as if sensing it was being watched. Then it turned slowly, deliberately, in our direction. I grabbed Charlie's arm. "Don't move!" For 5 long minutes we stood in absolute stillness, watching the creature. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in what looked like dark, coffee-colored hair. It was unmistakably walking on 2 legs, moving with a smooth, rolling gait that was disturbingly human-like, yet not human at all. Eventually, it turned away and headed toward the tree line, its upper body visible above the grass until it disappeared into the woods. Charlie's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Lynn, what the hell was that thing?" My hands were shaking. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," he said. "I think it was a Sasquatch." The words sounded ridiculous coming out of my mouth, but Charlie didn't laugh. "I saw it too," he said simply. "Whatever it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that." That night I called my father. He'd lived on this property for 40 years before moving to Florida for retirement. If anyone would know something, it would be him. "Dad," I said after our usual pleasantries, "has anything unusual ever happened on the property? Have you ever seen anything strange in the backfield?" The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Dad?" Why do you ask? His voice sounded careful, measured. I took a deep breath. I saw something, in the field. It was big, walking on two legs. It wasn't a bear. Another long pause. Then, I was 11 when I saw it, coming back from fishing at the creek. It was standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. I ran home and told my father. He told me never to speak of it again. My skin prickled. Why didn't you ever tell me? Would you have believed me? He asked. Would anyone? After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the dark field beyond my window. The property had been in our family for generations. How many others had seen what I'd seen and kept silent? 2 days later, I contacted Tim Vogel, a local investigator who specialized in unusual wildlife sightings. I found him online, and his website was surprisingly professional. No alien abductions or ghost hunting, just methodical documentation of unexplained animal encounters. Tim arrived the next morning driving a practical SUV with no cryptid hunting logos or conspiracy theory bumper stickers. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged guy in hiking boots and cargo pants. He carried a backpack full of equipment and a serious expression. "Show me where you saw it," he said after I'd described my encounters. We walked the property line. Tim stopped frequently to examine broken branches or unusual depressions in the ground. He took soil samples from areas where I'd seen the creature and made casts of what might have been large footprints in the muddy area near the creek. "Your property is perfect for them," Tim said as we walked back to the house. "You've got hardwoods for cover, open farmland, streams, marsh areas, and look at your surroundings. Deer everywhere, farm animals on neighboring properties. It's a bounty in the backyard." "Them?" I asked. Tim nodded. "Based on reports in this region and what you've described, there's likely more than one, possibly a family group." "In Connecticut? How is that possible? How could something that big go unnoticed?" "People see them all the time," Tim said. "They just don't report it. Who wants to be the crazy Bigfoot person? And these creatures are smart. They've avoided capture or definitive documentation for centuries. They know how to stay hidden." I thought about my father's experience decades ago on this same land. "So what do I do now?" "That depends," Tim said. "Are you afraid of them?" I considered the question. Despite the terror of that first sighting, I realized I wasn't afraid. Not in the way I'd be afraid of a dangerous predator. Unsettled, yes. Awestruck, definitely, but not fearful for my safety. "I don't think they want to hurt me," I said. "They could have many times over." Tim nodded. "In all my years investigating, I've never documented an unprovoked attack. They seem to avoid human contact whenever possible. So I just live with them? Pretend I don't see them? Or you acknowledge them," Tim said. "Not with cameras or by trying to interact, just with awareness. This was their territory, long before it was yours." That night, I sat on my back porch as darkness fell. Rex lay at my feet, alert but calm. The familiar sounds of the night surrounded us. Crickets, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Movement caught my eye at the edge of the field. Just a shadow, really. Something large, stepping back into the tree line. I didn't reach for my phone to take a picture. I didn't call out. I simply raised my hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement. The shadow paused, then disappeared into the darkness. 3 years have passed since that first sighting. I've seen the creatures 5 more times, always at a distance, always brief glimpses that could be denied or explained away if I chose to. I've found strange stick structures in the woods that Tim says are territorial markers. Twice I've discovered half-eaten deer carcasses in places where no normal predator would have left them. I haven't taken photos. I haven't set up cameras. This is their home as much as mine. And some mysteries deserve to remain mysteries. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the air is still, I sit on my porch and feel eyes watching from the darkness. and I know I'm not alone on my 20 acres in Maplewood. I never was. Story 14. I was 7 years old when it happened. Just a kid playing by myself near the second-story window of our farmhouse in Litchfield County. The fall weather had turned the sky grey that afternoon, but it wasn't raining yet. Mom and Dad were downstairs in the kitchen with the Wilsons from down the road, playing cards and laughing about something I couldn't hear. I remember pressing my small hands against the cool glass, watching the wind bend the tops of the trees at the edge of our property. Dad had finished ploughing the field just yesterday, and the fresh dirt made dark patterns across our land. I wasn't supposed to go outside since the weather looked like it might turn, so I stayed put, entertaining myself by counting the birds that landed on our fence posts. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow moving up the hill toward our house, but shadows don't have form. Shadows don't have substance. This thing did. It walked on 2 legs, striding up the slope of our front yard, with steps so long I couldn't believe it. 9 feet tall at least, with arms that hung down past where a normal person's knees would be. Its body was thin, but looked strong, covered in patches of black hair that didn't completely hide its skin underneath. The creature moved fast, like it had somewhere important to be. I froze. My breath fogged the window as I stared. The thing stopped near the big oak tree in our yard. Then it turned to look behind itself, and that's when I noticed something wasn't right about how it moved. Its whole upper body had to rotate to look back. Not just the neck, but the shoulders too, like its spine couldn't twist the way ours do. Then it happened. The creature's head snapped up, looking directly at my window. At me. Its eyes caught the grey daylight and reflected it back as a bright, sickly yellow glow, like when Dad shines his flashlight at the raccoons that get into our trash at night. But this was daytime. Eyes shouldn't glow in the daytime. We locked gazes for only a second, but time seemed to stretch out forever. I saw its face clearly then, flat-nosed with yellowish tan skin stretched tight across features that weren't quite right. Not human, not animal, something else. Then it moved again, disappearing around the side of our house. That's when the real fear hit me. It was coming inside. I was sure of it. I bolted from the window, my socks slipping on the hardwood floor as I scrambled for the stairs. I took them 3 at a time, nearly falling in my rush to get to my parents. My heart hammered in my chest so hard it hurt. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted as I burst into the kitchen. The 4 adults looked up from their card game, annoyed at the interruption. "Thomas Reed! What have I told you about yelling in the house?" Mom said, setting down her cards. "There's something outside," I gasped, pointing toward the window. "It's big, and it has yellow eyes, and it's coming." Dad exchanged a look with Mr. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson gave a little laugh. "Sounds like someone's been reading too many comic books," Dad said, ruffling my hair as he stood up. "Come on, I'll show you there's nothing out there." "No!" I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back. "You can't go outside, it'll get you." "Thomas, that's enough," Mom said firmly. "Stop this nonsense right now." Dad sighed. "Tell you what, buddy, let's all go take a look together, and then you'll see there's nothing to be afraid of." Before I could protest further, Dad was guiding me toward the back door with his hand on my shoulder. Mom followed, along with the Wilsons, who seemed amused by the whole thing. The moment Dad opened that door, pure terror surged through me. I couldn't go out there. I wouldn't. "No!" I screamed, twisting away from his grip. I backed up against the wall, shaking my head frantically. "It's out there! It's waiting!" Dad tried to coax me, but when he reached for my hand, something in me snapped. I darted past him through the open door, but instead of running into the yard, I pressed myself against the outside of the house, beating on the door when it swung shut behind me. "Let me in! Let me in!" I shrieked, pounding my small fists against the wood. Tears streamed down my face as I sobbed uncontrollably. "It's gonna get me!" The door flew open, and Mom pulled me inside, her expression no longer irritated but genuinely concerned. I collapsed against her, my whole body trembling. "Thomas, what in God's name has gotten into you?" she demanded, kneeling down to my level. Through hiccuping sobs, I told them everything, about the creature walking up the hill, about its strange movements and glowing yellow eyes, about how it had looked right at me before disappearing around the house. Dad and Mr. Wilson exchanged glances again, but this time they weren't dismissive. Something in my terror had gotten through to them. "All right, son," Dad said slowly. "You stay here with your mother and Mrs. Wilson. Frank and I will take a look around." "Be careful, John," Mom said, her arm tight around my shoulders. Dad grabbed his shotgun from the closet, and Mr. Wilson picked up a heavy flashlight from the counter. They stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind them. I could hear my own ragged breathing as we waited. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. 5 minutes passed. 10. When the back door finally opened again, Dad and Mr. Wilson stepped inside. Their faces had changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen on my father's face before. Fear. "Well?" Mom asked. Dad put his shotgun away without answering. Mr. Wilson sat heavily in a kitchen chair. "We found tracks," Dad finally said, his voice unnaturally quiet. "Big ones. Bigger than anything I've ever seen." "Human?" Mrs. Wilson asked. Her earlier amusement completely vanished. "No," Mr. Wilson shook his head. "Not human, not bear either. I don't know what made those prints." Dad looked at me with new eyes. "They go all around the house just like Thomas said, and they're spaced so far apart. Frank here is 6'2", and he could barely stretch from one footprint to the next. We followed them across the plowed field," Mr. Wilson added. "But then—" He trailed off, looking at me. I couldn't stand it. "But then what?" I demanded. "Nothing, son," Dad said quickly. "We just lost the trail, that's all." I knew he was lying. There was something else, something they weren't telling me. "I want to see," I said suddenly, moving toward the door. "Absolutely not," Mom said, tightening her grip on my shoulder. But I needed to see it. I needed to know I wasn't crazy. I twisted away from her and ran for the door before anyone could stop me. The cool afternoon air hit my face as I burst outside. I made it about 10 steps before I saw them. Massive indentations in the soft earth of our yard. They were shaped like feet, but elongated and huge, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. Dad caught up to me, grabbing my arm. "Thomas, get back inside right now." But something had changed in me. The fear was still there, but now curiosity fought against it. "Where do they go?" I asked, pointing to the tracks that led away from our house. Dad hesitated, then sighed. "They go across the field and over to Sawmill Road." "I want to follow them," I said, surprising myself with my boldness. "Not on foot," Dad said firmly. "If you really want to see, we'll take the truck." Minutes later, we were all piled into Dad's pickup. Mom, Dad, and me in the cab, with the Wilsons in the truck bed. Dad drove slowly along Sawmill Road, his eyes scanning the shoulder. "There!" Mr. Wilson shouted, banging on the roof of the cab. "The tracks cross the road right here!" Dad stopped the truck, and we all got out. Sure enough, the same massive footprints emerged from the field on one side of the road and continued up the wooded hill on the other. Something about seeing those tracks heading into the darkness between the trees broke whatever courage I'd managed to gather. I started shaking again, remembering those glowing yellow eyes. "It's in there," I whispered, pointing at the woods. "It's watching us." Dad must have heard the rising panic in my voice because he quickly lifted me up and put me back in the truck. "That's enough tracking for today," he said, his voice deliberately calm. "Let's head home." As we drove away, I kept my eyes fixed on those woods until they disappeared from view. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever had made those tracks was still out there. That night, Dad nailed my bedroom window shut. He told Mom it was to keep the drafts out, but I knew the real reason. He believed me now. For weeks afterward, I refused to be alone. I slept in my parents' room, curled up in a sleeping bag on their floor. Dad started keeping his shotgun closer at hand. The Wilsons never spoke about what they'd seen that day, but they stopped coming over for card games. Eventually, the raw terror faded. I started sleeping in my own room again. The window stayed nailed shut for a year before Dad finally removed the nails, telling me I was a big boy now and there was nothing to be afraid of. But I knew better. 35 years passed. I grew up, moved away, built a life for myself. But I never forgot what I saw that day in Litchfield County. The memories stayed vivid, while other childhood recollections faded. The yellow, glowing eyes, the thin but muscular frame, the sparse black hair covering tannish yellow skin, the flat-nosed face that wasn't quite right. I never saw the creature again, but sometimes on cloudy fall days I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. I check windows reflexively, making sure they're locked. I avoid wooded areas at dusk. People ask me if I'm sure about what I saw, if maybe it was just a bear or a man in a costume, if my 7-year-old imagination had transformed something ordinary into something monstrous. But I know what I saw, and so did my father and Mr. Wilson when they found those tracks, footprints so large they couldn't stretch their legs from one to the next. Whatever left those prints wasn't human. It wasn't any animal known to science. I'm 42 now, with children of my own. We live in the city, far from any woods or fields. My kids think it's strange that I always insist on checking that their windows are locked at night, even in summer. They don't understand why I get tense when we drive through rural areas. I've never told them about the creature. Some terrors are too heavy to pass down, but sometimes when I'm alone, I find myself staring out windows, scanning the horizon, waiting. Because I know it's still out there somewhere, walking with that unnatural gait, its long arms swinging by its sides, yellow eyes glowing even in daylight, and maybe, just maybe, it remembers me too. Story 15. My breath made little clouds in the cold morning air as I adjusted the scope on my rifle. The sun was bright, but offered little warmth in the Eagle Meadows hunting grounds above Strawberry, California. My husband Dale and I had been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to bag a deer and stock our freezer for winter. Remember, Becky, stay quiet and keep your eyes peeled, Dale whispered as we crouched beneath the towering pines at the edge of the meadow. He kissed me quickly on the cheek before we separated to our hunting spots. We positioned ourselves about 10 feet apart under different trees, both with clear views across the roughly 300-yard-wide meadow stretching before us. A thick clump of trees and bushes about 100 yards ahead blocked us from seeing each other's hunting zones. Perfect positioning. We could cover more ground this way. I settled into my spot, back against rough pine bark, rifle resting across my knees. The forest was alive with small sounds, birds calling, leaves rustling, the occasional scurry of a squirrel. My watch read 10:05 a.m. The waiting game had begun. About 20 minutes in, the sound of branches breaking echoed from across the meadow. I tensed, finger hovering near the trigger guard. Not on it. Safety first, always. Dale's hushed voice carried to me. "Becky, keep alert. Might be bears." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Bears weren't uncommon in these parts. We'd seen tracks on previous hunts, and while they usually avoided humans, surprising one was never good. The forest fell silent again. I scanned the tree line across the meadow, searching for movement. Nothing. Just trees swaying gently in the breeze, dappled sunlight playing across the forest floor. At around 10:30, maybe closer to 11, I wasn't checking my watch anymore. Something caught my eye. Across the meadow, standing partially obscured by vegetation, was a dark figure that hadn't been there minutes before. My first thought was bear. Had to be. I squinted, trying to make out details through the distance and shadows. The figure was black, with sunlight streaming from behind it, creating a silhouette effect. But something wasn't right about the shape. Bears don't stand like that. Maybe it was just shadows from the trees, a trick of the light, or perhaps a dead log I hadn't noticed before. None of these explanations fit what I was seeing. The figure stood upright, too tall for a bear, too solid for shadows. I remained absolutely still, barely breathing as I studied it. From my angle I could make out most of its head, about 3/4 of its chest, and down to what might have been its waist. The rest was hidden behind trees and brush. My heart pounded against my ribs as a single thought crystallized in my mind. Sasquatch, the legendary creature of the forests. I'd heard stories since childhood, but had always dismissed them as campfire tales. I needed a better look. With painstaking slowness, I raised my binoculars to my eyes, careful not to make any sudden movements. The world jumped closer through the lenses, and what I saw sent ice water rushing through my veins. 2 yellow eyes stared directly at me, not the unfocused gaze of an animal glancing in my general direction. These eyes were locked onto mine, with frightening intelligence and focus. It knew exactly where I was. It was watching me. My finger twitched toward my rifle, but I didn't dare move. The creature remained motionless, except for those eyes, which blinked occasionally as it continued its unnerving surveillance. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me frozen against the tree, it watching me from across the meadow. 15 minutes. Maybe more. My legs started to cramp from holding still for so long, but terror kept me locked in place. What did it want? Why was it watching me? My mind raced with questions as sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold. It never made an aggressive move. It just watched. And somehow that was more terrifying than if it had charged across the meadow toward me. Eventually, my instincts screamed at me to leave. Now, I couldn't stay here being observed by this thing any longer. With my eyes still locked on the creature, I slowly raised my hand and made a small motion in Dale's direction, signaling I was heading back to camp. I couldn't find my voice to explain why. My throat felt constricted with fear. As I began to back away, the creature's gaze intensified. I swear I saw its head tilt slightly, like it was curious about what I was doing. I turned and started climbing back up the stony hillside we'd descended earlier. My boots slipped on loose rocks as I scrambled upward, abandoning all pretense of stealth. Every few seconds I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature pursuing me across the meadow. It never did. Each time I looked back, it remained in the same spot, those yellow eyes following my retreat. By the time I reached our campsite, my legs were trembling and my breath came in ragged gasps. I collapsed onto a folding chair outside our tent and clutched my rifle across my lap, scanning the tree line obsessively. An hour later, Dale trudged into camp, looking confused. "What happened out there, Becky? You took off without a word." I opened my mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I saw something, Dale, across the meadow." He set his rifle down carefully before pulling up a chair beside me. "A deer?" "No." I swallowed hard. "A Sasquatch." Dale's face registered surprise, then concern. "You sure about that? Could have been a bear standing up." "It wasn't a bear." My voice gained strength as I described what I'd seen. "It was watching me, Dale, for 15 minutes at least, just staring with these yellow eyes." "I didn't see anything unusual," he said slowly, "and I was only 10 feet away from you." That's when something else occurred to me that sent a fresh wave of goosebumps across my skin. It found me specifically, Dale. It watched me without ever crossing the meadow or coming into your line of sight. Dale looked unsettled but skeptical. "The sun can play tricks on your eyes out there." "Maybe it wasn't a trick," I cut him off. "I know what I saw." We sat in silence for a while. The forest around our camp suddenly seemed less familiar, less safe. "You want to pack up?" Dale finally asked. We can head back today instead of tomorrow. I considered it. Part of me wanted nothing more than to get in our truck and drive far away from Eagle Meadows. But another part, a small, curious part that was beginning to emerge as the initial terror subsided, wondered about the creature. It hadn't tried to harm me. It had just watched, like it was studying me. Perhaps these creatures were simply curious about humans. No, I decided. Let's stay. But I don't think I want to go back to that meadow. Dale nodded, relief evident on his face. He'd been looking forward to this trip for months. That night, as we sat around our campfire, I kept scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. The flames cast dancing shadows among the trees, and more than once I jumped at what I thought was movement in the forest. "You really believe it was a Sasquatch?" Dale asked, poking at the fire with a stick. I nodded. I've never believed in them before, thought they were just stories. But what I saw today, I shivered despite the fire's warmth. It was real, Dale. What do you think it wanted? I stared into the flames, remembering those intelligent yellow eyes. I don't know. Maybe they're just as curious about us as we are about them. You think there are more? Must be, I said. If they're real, and after today I'm convinced they are, there has to be a population of them. They've probably been watching us for years, staying hidden, observing. The thought made me glance over my shoulder again. Were we being watched even now? We turned in early that night, tired from the morning's hunt and the tension that had followed. Inside our tent, Dale fell asleep quickly, his soft snores filling the small space. I lay awake, replaying the encounter in my mind. Around midnight I heard it, branches breaking outside, heavy footsteps circling our campsite. My body went rigid with fear. Dale slept on, oblivious. The footsteps paused outside our tent. I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic breaths that didn't sound human. Something large was standing just feet away from where I lay, separated only by the thin fabric of our tent. I reached over and shook Dale awake, clamping my hand over his mouth before he could speak. His eyes flew open in alarm. I put a finger to my lips and pointed toward the sound. He nodded, reaching slowly for the hunting knife he kept beside his sleeping bag. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we lay perfectly still, listening to the creature move around our camp. It never made any aggressive moves toward the tent. It seemed to be investigating, touching our cooking gear, moving the chairs, examining our supplies. Eventually, the sounds receded as whatever it was moved back into the forest. Dawn found us still awake, whispering theories about what had happened. Could have been a bear, Dale suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. Bears don't investigate campsites like that. They knock things over looking for food. This was methodical. When we finally emerged from our tent, we found our campsite disturbed in strange ways. Nothing was damaged or stolen, but items had been moved and rearranged. Our cooking pots were stacked in size order. The firewood had been organized into a neat pile. My backpack, which I'd left leaning against a tree, was now sitting upright and zipped closed. Bears definitely don't do that, Dale admitted, staring at the reorganized campsite. We spent the morning discussing what to do. Part of me wanted to try and find the creature again, this time prepared and less afraid. What might we learn from such an encounter? These beings had apparently lived alongside humans for generations without being properly documented. "Are you crazy?" Dale exclaimed when I suggested going back to the meadow. "That thing could be dangerous." "If it wanted to hurt us, it had every opportunity last night," I pointed out. "I think it's just curious. In the end, we compromised. We'd stay one more night, but we'd remain at camp together. If the creature returned, we'd observe it from the safety of our tent. That night, we sat by the fire much later than usual, both of us watching and waiting. The forest remained quiet. No footsteps, no breaking branches. Around 1 a.m., exhaustion overtook us, and we retreated to our tent. I dreamed of yellow eyes watching me through the trees. Morning came with no further visitations. We packed up camp in silence, both disappointed and relieved. As Dale loaded the last of our gear into the truck, I stood at the edge of our campsite, staring into the forest. "We'll come back," I said, mostly to myself. "Next season, better prepared." Dale looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You actually want to come back, after being scared half to death?" I turned to him, surprised to find I was smiling. "The fear is fading, Dale. Now I just feel curious. Don't you want to know more about them? What they are? How they live?" He shook his head, but I could see a glimmer of interest in his eyes. "Maybe, but next time we bring cameras and more people." As we drove away from Eagle Meadows, I kept my eyes on the forest passing by my window. Just before we turned onto the main road, I caught a flash of movement among the trees, something large and dark, moving with surprising grace for its size. I didn't point it out to Dale. Some encounters are meant to be personal. When we got home to our little house on the outskirts of Strawberry, life quickly returned to normal. I went back to my job at the local grocery store, Dale to his work at the lumber mill. But at night, I found myself researching Sasquatch sightings, reading accounts from others who claimed to have seen these creatures. Some stories matched mine, intelligent beings who observed humans from a distance. Others described aggressive encounters, though these were rare. I started making notes, planning our return trip for the next hunting season, better equipment, motion-activated cameras, perhaps audio recording devices. Dale humored me, though I could tell he remained skeptical despite what we'd experienced. The nightmares faded with time. The yellow eyes that had haunted my dreams became less threatening, more intriguing. In their place grew a determination to understand what I'd seen that cold morning in Eagle Meadows. Whatever was watching me across that meadow had changed my life forever. The world was bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than I'd ever imagined. And somewhere in the forests above Strawberry, California, intelligent eyes were watching and waiting for our return. I'd be ready next time.